Good morning and welcome to the 7th meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2025. The first item on our agenda is consideration of subordinate legislation, SSI 2025-26, the Level 1, Level 2 Disclosure Review Application Scotland Regulations 2025. This instrument is being considered under the negative procedure. Do members have any comments about this instrument? No comments. Is the committee agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? That is agreed. Okay, the next item on our agenda today is to take evidence on our widening access inquiry. We've got two panels of witnesses, and for our first panel, can I welcome Professor John McKendrick, the Commissioner for Fair Access, who is joining us remotely today. For full transparency, Professor McKendrick, I have informed committee members that we know each other in your former guise as a professional football referee in the SPFL, where we operated together. So I'm delighted to welcome you along to committee today and give you the opportunity to make some opening remarks. Professor McKendrick.
Douglas, and I do welcome the opportunity to have some opening remarks. First of all, to thank the committee for the inquiry. I think it's timely. It shows a commitment to the issue. And also thanking the committee for allowing me the opportunity to address and provide evidence. I think it's fair to say there are three broad agendas we have in Scotland that are interlinked. Tackling poverty, child poverty, narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap, and then trying to achieve fair access in higher education. In my opinion, all three are worth pursuing. I think the other two agendas, tackling child poverty and narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap, are necessary but insufficient if we want to achieve fair access in higher education. And I think it was a very interesting day yesterday in terms of these issues. There was the release of the latest data on attainment in schools. There was also an article in the Times newspaper making some comments on fair access. And I want to start my opening remarks by referring to both. It's certainly the case then that in terms of narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap, that the most recent data that was released for schools is unhelpful in terms of the broader aim of achieving fair access in higher education. The evidence suggests then that the poverty-related attainment gap is not narrowing in Scotland. And certainly if it was narrowing, it would make fair access easier to achieve. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that within the data that was released yesterday, there's also some relevant evidence that shows progress that's been made. For example, hidden in the data was the evidence that the number of those from the 20% most deprived areas who have progressed to higher education has increased in Scotland in each of the last 6 years. Now, higher education includes university, but also HND and HNC. But I think that in itself is an important point that we should not overlook. Progress been made year on year, additions to those from the 20% most deprived areas for 6 years. And it used to be about 10 to 12 years ago that there were 3 times as many entrants to higher education from the least affluent areas compared to the most deprived areas. That's now twice as many. Now, twice as many, we might argue, is a sign that there is more work to do, but it's also a sign that significant progress has been made. So while certainly yesterday's data couldn't be celebrated, I think there nevertheless were some signs of welcoming progress that's been made in recent years. To refer to the Times article, so there was an article in yesterday's Times that I think is relevant to the committee. It may have been something that some of the committee members had referenced or might even wish to refer to in the deliberations. The Times article largely was articulating Universities Scotland's position, and that was that the not narrowing of the poverty-related attainment gap is a problem in terms of meeting the fair access target. And I've made reference to that point already. But there was also a quote in the Times article that was attributed to myself, and I want to read out the quote, and I think it's really important I give clarification to this at the outset. The article mistakenly asserts that I admitted that widening access to deprived pupils on low grades would mean that more middle and upper class pupils would be locked out of university, including some with stellar grades at high school. Now, I've had an exchange with the Scottish editor, a very constructive exchange, but I have to emphasise to the committee, I do not recognise these words and I do not concur with the message. Thanks, Douglas.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, and I think it perhaps is something we'll come on to during our session with you. Can I first of all start going back to your appointment? When you were appointed as Commissioner for Fair Access, What did you feel about that? What did you want to achieve? And now, over a year into the post, you've had one report, you're finalising your second report. What do you feel has been achieved in that time, with you and others working collaboratively? And what areas do you think could have been actioned in your more than first year that are still waiting to be progressed?
Yeah, there are certainly some things that are ongoing work. I think what I've certainly noticed is a change of pace in the last 6 months, even as recently as that. There almost seems a renewed energy in the issue. Some interesting developments in terms of trying to make progress and some long-standing ambitions in this agenda. And I'd like to come on to that and discuss in more detail. I was highly motivated when I took on this post. I seen it as a coming together of interests I have. I have an interest in school education. I do some support for the Scottish Attainment Challenge. My core work is child poverty. And as I say, I see these three agendas have been linked. I think they're good for Scotland. I think it says something about us that we want to allow individuals to achieve their potential. So it was an agenda that I stepped into with a lot of motivation and an acknowledgement of good work that had been done. But if I'm perfectly honest about it, it was an agenda that I didn't understand as much as I thought I did when I took it on. I didn't understand the range of work that's undertaken, not just in higher education, but in colleges, by third sector partners and in schools that work towards achieving this end. So much of my early time as Commissioner was really understanding the landscape and understanding why the progress had been made and what the barriers to that progress were. And now we turn to action, if you like. We turn to take concrete steps to make the progress that has to be made. I did sense some frustration in the last Commissioner that, almost on an annual basis, that there were some points that the previous Commissioner had made that it was getting frustrated that there was no progress made on. And again, I look at that, I can see that perhaps we're beginning to address these issues more directly than we were in the past. Disappointments, and I think it's important I give a balanced view that there hasn't been in the last two rounds of formal report and widening access data any increase in the number from the most deprived areas progressing to higher education. Again, we'll come on to that, I'm sure, in more detail. But that certainly has been a disappointment. When I have been in post, there has been no evidential progress of an increase towards that next target. I don't, however, necessarily think that's a significant problem, given more recent indications and also the work that's been undertaken to underpin further progress to fair access.
Your first report was published in January of last year, but it was September before the government issued their response to your report. Is that the timescale you were expecting, or would you benefit from greater urgency in the government responding to your report quicker?
I think it's fair to say a quicker response would be helpful. There are perhaps good reasons for why it was why the response was delayed in that particular year, but yeah, absolutely, we'd be looking for a quicker response. I have to say that the policy team that underpins the work of the Scottish Government, I'm in regular contact with them and the analytical team as well.
Were you given any reasons for the delayed response?
I think there were data reasons last year for delays, which meant it difficult to apply more timely.
And you say in your written submission to the committee that you're finalising this year's report. When can we expect it, to put a time frame on your homework for this year?
Yeah, published, yes. My homework should be able to be marked by the end of March.
End of March. Of the 20 recommendations that you had in last year's report, they were all either agreed or partially agreed by the Scottish Government, barring one, which was looking at strengthening your remit to include colleges. And that's something that I've discussed with some of the representatives who are interested in this subject. Given that basically the government dismissed that completely, they are not keen on that, will that be a recommendation you keep coming back to, or do you accept that this current Scottish Government won't agree to strengthening your remit?
I think it's the right thing for Scotland. The fair access work has a tertiary perspective rather than a higher education perspective. I understand the reasons why perhaps it was rejected. It was perhaps felt that we must throw our energies into meeting the targets that we've already been set, and that given that the next interim target was soon upon us, that perhaps it would be unwise to broaden the agenda at that point in time. So I can understand why it was rejected, but I completely and wholeheartedly believe that the right thing for Scotland is that when we're thinking about fair access, when we're thinking about the appropriate outcomes for young people and adults returning to education, that we also consider further education as well as higher education.
Last couple of questions from me. You, again, say in your written evidence that you wouldn't be supportive of crude interventions which were deployed simply in order to achieve the next interim target. Could you outline some of those kind of crude interventions that you think would be counterproductive?
Sure, and first of all, nobody is proposing these crude interventions, so I think they can relax and not worry about that. But it's within universities' gift to decide who enters university. They could, for example, decide that they would only enter those from deprived area backgrounds in order to meet that target. Now, that's an incredibly crude measure that could be undertaken. It would meet the target. And if we were only interested in meeting the target, then we could do that. Nobody is arguing for that. It wouldn't be right for individuals. It would be socially unjust. But I think the point being that if we wanted to meet the target for meeting the target's sake, we could do so. The more important point is we meet the target doing the right things at the right time in the right way, rather than just meeting the target for the target's sake.
Okay, and one of your other recommendations is the adoption of a universal student identifier and the establishment of a national tracking system, which should be a priority action. That sounds like a fairly reasonable proposal. Why has it not happened before now? And why is it still an action rather than actually being delivered?
Yeah, well, that's one of the issues that we seem to be making a little bit more progress on, or taking with a little bit more attention than I think previously. It's absolutely central. If we want to ensure that the public purse has been spent wisely, that we're able to track the progress, we're able to understand the journeys of young people, perhaps through further education into higher education, perhaps into the world of work and then returning to education. If we want to understand what works, if we want to understand transition in the longer term, we need this system. I'm not the only one that's been arguing for this system. It's been argued by the First Commissioner. It's been argued for by the University of Scotland and others within the sector. I think it requires resource to be committed. I think I would very much welcome the committee's support in arguing that this is resource that would be well spent. As I say, I think there is commitment to it within the sector. I don't think there is anybody that thinks it's a bad idea, but it does require resource and commitment and leadership if we are to introduce such a universal student number.
So do you think it just comes down to that, a lack of available funds to implement this? Because I can't, like you, understand a reason why this wouldn't be progressed. Yeah,
I think that's what it comes down to. We have the technical ability to deliver it. I wouldn't say it would be easy, but we have something similar in the health system in Scotland where we have the one number that works. There is no reason why it shouldn't have the same in education.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Professor. Thank you for taking the time for coming along today. You've said that work to progress the introduction of additional data measures is a priority. Can you give the committee an update on what the progress is of this work and what you think needs to happen next?
Sure, there are probably two dimensions to this. There is one that the indicator we have is a sensible indicator in the early stages of fair access work, and by that the indicator referring to is the 20% most deprived areas. And we already mentioned that in 2010 there was 3 times as many from the least affluent progressing to higher education compared to the most deprived. So we do understand there was a gap there that was worth narrowing, and that measure allowed us to measure the gap. However, there are some inconsistencies with that measure. We know, for example, from wider work in poverty that there are more disadvantaged people that live outside our most deprived areas, and there are more people in our most deprived areas who are not disadvantaged. I live in one of Scotland's 10% most deprived areas. My youngest daughter should not be benefiting from any fair access work, given our family background, but perhaps would because of simply where we live. So while it is a helpful indicator to one degree, I think it's not the right indicator. And the right indicator is one that would measure individual circumstance. So again, I understand why it was introduced in the first place, but I think we're now at a more mature stage in our fair access work, and it's time to rethink that we can have an optimal indicator rather than a convenient indicator. And an optimal indicator would be one that measures individual circumstance. Free school meals is something that's currently being explored. There is a trial been undertaken in the north east of Scotland to understand whether we could use free school meals data more effectively as the indicator of fair access. I think there are, as I understand, there are challenges to be overcome in terms of permissions, data agreements to be sought. But again, I think these are surmountable issues. I think these are also data that I think the public would be very surprised if it found out that we weren't using these data to optimal effect. The data, although it's a different system in down south, they are able to use free school meal data to measure fair access work south of the border. As I say, it's a different system that doesn't allow that to take place here in Scotland. But I think that's something that there is work going on. I would be very disappointed if there is not concrete progress to be made in this in the short term. So that's one aspect, is getting a better single indicator of fair access and shifting away from an area-based measure to an individual-based measure. I think the second dimension is, though, that having a sharp focus on any single indicator undersells the fair access work that we do in Scotland. Now, I do understand that one of the other issues the committee was interested in was a broader range of circumstances that challenge people to get access to higher education. And I think we must acknowledge there is a lot of work that goes on in universities, both to get students in, and then when they're in, to support students with a broad range of backgrounds and challenges to succeed in their studies. But we only measure fair access in terms of 20% most deprived areas. So the two dimensions that in terms of the progress we have to make, I think ultimately we need a better single indicator, which is our headline indicator. But we also need a basket of indicators that tells that broader story of that broader range of work that we're doing to facilitate access for all with talent, to get the most from their talent at higher education.
Okay, thank you.
Pamela King-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, and good morning, Professor McKendrick. Thank you for joining us, and thank you also for your opening statement. I want to ask a question a little bit about the measures, and I'll come to the basket of measures in a moment. You also talk about in your report about the importance of measuring entry, but also student experience and outcomes. Can you tell us a bit about why that's important?
Yeah, there's absolutely no point in getting people into higher education if they don't succeed in higher education and thrive beyond it. It's a waste of public money. It's a waste of people's time if they are not succeeding in their higher education. So we do measure just now the staying on rates, if you like, the retention rates after 1 year, which is one very crude measure of success in higher education. But I think there is much more that can be done in terms of measuring success. We do also measure the destinations at the departure point from university. But again, I think there is more that can be done to make more of these data. I think we also have data that we don't work hard enough. I think the data that we hold as institutions could work a little bit harder. At least, the story could be shared more widely to demonstrate the extent to which and the ways in which those who come from a fair access background are progressing in their studies. So I think it's vitally important, both in terms of public interest, that our money has been well spent in pursuing this agenda, but also in terms of social justice, to make sure it's not just a lot of energy to get students in and then forgetting about them when they're in. We have to support them to enable them to succeed in their studies when they're there, and to set them up for a future which allows them to realise the potential of those skills acquired and pursued through the studies when they leave university too.
Thank you for that. Is there anything in the data that you've seen in the work that you do that tells us a story about those students, particularly in terms of student experience and the outcomes longer term?
So we don't have enough data on this Pam. I mean, it's certainly, if you look at the retention data, then there is a gap. It's not an extensive gap, but there is a gap for those from the more deprived backgrounds and other students in terms of whether they're retained in university. That tells us something. So in terms very crudely, whether they actually maintain their studies, it tells us that there's something not quite right, because more of the students from a more deprived background are not progressing in their studies. But it doesn't tell us about the experience of the studies, why that might be the case. So I do think we need better data to understand that. But again, if we look at the data on entry and the data on graduation, there is a gap has emerged by those two times, because the retention rate is something that is there for the 4 years of university study, and by the time it gets to that exit, the gap is not it's not 16.4% that are graduating from the 20% most deprived areas. The figure is less.
Thank you. And I think a colleague will probably be asking some more questions on that particular issue in a moment, and I don't want to steal those questions. But thank you for that. The unique identifier, the number that you've just been speaking about, I happen to think that sounds really useful. Can you tell us anything about that you've learned from the pilots that are going on in Aberdeen that would really benefit from that number? And do you think it needs legislation, or could we do it without legislation?
I'm not sure if it needs legislation, Pam, and I genuinely don't know if it needs legislation for that to happen. I'd be surprised if it did. But if it does, then I would impress upon the committee, the Parliament more generally, the importance of that. That's legislation worth making, because it's about efficient public spend. If we want to understand what works, we need to have a much better data system than we currently have. Many of the initiatives that are undertaken are plausible. Many of the initiatives that are undertaken in schools, they're well regarded by schools. They seem to be doing the right things, but whether they are doing the right things, we only really genuinely know if we've got the data to track that through time. There are very good reasons that if we want to make the right decisions with public investment, the right decisions with the limited resource that we have, we need a much better data system to support that. So that undoubtedly would be the case. The Aberdeen initiative then, which is about using free school meals as an indicator, is not so much about a universal student identifier. I think the universal student identifier goes beyond that issue. It would maybe raise the question about whether there are other schemes that are going on in the schools in the North East that are also leading to the success rates or non-success rates of who gets to progress to university.
Thank you. And if there's time, I just have one final question. Again, this is in the kind of student experience space. Some of the evidence that we've had to committee as part of this inquiry talks about the funding and support available to students whilst they're at university. So I recall the NUS report that spoke about how education is free but studying isn't. And one of the comments that we've had is that the current system on bursaries and grants and student support isn't as progressive as it might be. Do you have a view on that?
I think it almost seems implausible that if you have a free education system that it can't be progressive. And it seems an implausible point to make. If it's free education, then surely everybody will benefit from it. But the reality is that students must exist while they're in their studies. And the cost of study in terms of bursary fee, in terms of fee for learning is not the only cost they incur. They must exist. They must feed themselves. They must travel to university. There are many costs that are involved just simply with living. And the bursary costs are not sufficient at the current time. There has been the increase in the entitlement of students to have a loan portion up to the equivalent of the national living wage. And that's welcomed and was welcomed by NUS Scotland. But the reality is, and it is a reality that I think that sometimes we don't face up to, is that many students do their best to minimise the amount of loan that they have to incur. And doing their best to minimise the amount of loan they incur leads them to undertake paid work, complementing their studies. Now, there is nothing wrong with paid work. The QB report many years ago recommended that, that there were benefits from students undertaking paid work in combination with their studies, and recommended that perhaps 10 hours a week would be the maximum that students should undertake. I think the contemporary reality is that many of our students are undertaking much more than what we think is a reasonable amount of paid work in combination with their studies. In effect, we have full-time students that are combining that with being part-time plus work. And I think that's an issue we have to face up to. I'm not saying that it should mean that we should completely do away with bursaries and loans rather than replace them all with bursaries. I understand the cost of the public purse of doing that. But I think we have to have a realistic and honest conversation about the realities of student life and student financing, and the realities of how students are spending their time. Are they able to get the most out of their studies when they have to work, not choose to work, but when they have to work in order to continue with their studies? And I'm not convinced that for a significant proportion of our students, they're not able to get the most out of their studies because they have to work more than I think is reasonable to do so while pursuing a higher education.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Convener. Thanks very much for everything you've given us so far, Professor McKendrick. Just on the back of that, do you believe that there's a lack of an active framework for fair access? And on the basis of that, how much impact has this had on the progress towards bringing everyone up to the same level?
Sorry, Bill, I'm not quite sure what you meant by framework.
It's between how different sectors work together to share the evidenced successful access initiatives. So that's the framework it would be.
Sorry, thanks, Bill.
No,
Thanks for that. I think we have a system that understands the role that's played by other parts. Maybe even when critical of the other parts, such as yesterday when University of Scotland expressed some concern that school wasn't delivering what it needed in order to achieve fair access. That tells you that the universities understand that schools have to work if they are to achieve fair access. The vital role of colleges in facilitating access to higher education is also acknowledged as really important by universities too. So I think we have a system that understands the importance of other parts of the system. I think in terms of whether information is shared, I sense it is. You know, I sense there's an organisation called the SCAP, the Scottish Community of Access and Participation Practitioners. This was introduced as part of the fair access work at the outset then. And that gives a space where those that are working in this field from different institutions come together to share practice. And I think that's much underestimated, the importance of that. And my involvement with that, which is attending events and providing support where I can, is I see that as a true collective, that there is that sharing experience, that sharing of understanding, the desire not to be protective, not to think that the information we hold is commercially sensitive and only for the benefit of our institution, but actually to share that practice amongst the wider community in higher education and further education too. So I do sense, Bill, that there's that collective sense of purpose that's there across the sector, and an understanding that actually all parts of the system have to work if this ultimate goal of fair access to higher education is to be achieved.
That's very positive. Thanks very much, John. Thank you very much. And
we'll move to John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. I'd like to kind of maybe pursue a little more what Jackie Dunbar was looking at about the SIMD areas. I was just looking at a map, actually, of my own constituency in that. And I get that it's a kind of, I think the argument is it's a bit rough and ready, perhaps, and there's better off people in lower deciles and poorer people in other areas. But, I mean, is it not the case that it's a good measure? It's one that people understand. It's kind of clear-cut. And, once we start bringing in this, that, and the next thing, does it not all just become very vague and it's quite hard to pin down if we're making progress or not?
John, I'd agree that there would be no point in taking away an indicator that's widely understood with one that becomes more complicated, and therefore the agenda it becomes more obtuse. That's not what I'm proposing. I'm proposing that we can find a better indicator that people can equally understand as an individual measure of deprivation. I absolutely also am not saying there is no merit in SIMD. There absolutely is. I mean, constituencies such as yours, for example, being part of a broader area that's challenging, impacts on everybody in that area. So there is additional merit in an area-based measure, but there are complications with area-based measures, which mean that the closer we get to 20%, the more problematic it becomes to pursue that as the only single indicator, the only measure of our progress. The most dramatic example of that are rural areas. So, for example, Orkney and Shetland, no 20% most deprived areas in these two areas. Now, we know there are families in Orkney and Shetland, if we take away the remote rural issues, for one, but there are families in remote, in rural, and there are families in Orkney and Shetland who will be economically disadvantaged, but they're not part of this. They're not part of the catch in terms of what we're trying to do, what we're measuring is fair access work. Now, there is work going on to promote fair access wherever there is disadvantage, but in terms of what we measure, I think we could be sharper in what we measure. So, to cut to the chase in response to your point, John, I think there has been merit in SIMD. There continues to be merit in SIMD. It would not be a crisis if we continue to use SIMD, but it's not the best measure. I think there's a risk that the public would be increasingly undermine their commitment to this agenda because some of the inconsistency will become more apparent as we get closer to the target. And ultimately, the right thing to do is to take a target that is direct, it's sharp in terms of who we're trying to target, and an individual measure would be better. As far as the basket of indicators goes, I think that is a delicate balance that I think is worth striking, because yes, if we have a single indicator, it's very clear what we're measuring progress on, and I continue to advocate we should have a single headline measure. But there's also that danger that only when a single headline measure, which is very easy to understand, that we do ourselves a disservice by not being able to tell that broader story of the access work we're undertaking. So I think that there's a balance to be struck, that we need the right indicator, which is a headline indicator, but we need, if you like, a subsidiary tier of broader indicators that tell that broader fair access story. And I think it's well within the gift of ourselves as communicators and the broader general public as consumers to understand what that data are telling us.
So if you're arguing for that there should be one headline indicator, but it could be a better one, is free school meals the one that you would be inclined to go for?
I think just now that looks the most promising. You could also argue that the Scottish Child Payment might be something further down the line that would be promising. The free school meals is not perfect if we don't have a full data system, because many of those who are the fair access population entering higher education are adult returners. The adult returners, and they don't have that ready free school meal data because they're not in school that day. That's not their entry point back into education. So it's not a perfect indicator, and we have to make sure that what we don't do is replace an imperfect indicator with another imperfect indicator. But as I say, I think there is work to be done, and just now I think that looks the best indicator, the most promising of all that are there.
Yeah, because I mean, I take your point that it's not perfect either, because there's the whole thing about stigma that some families who probably are entitled to free school meals don't actually claim them. And I mean, one of the issues that strikes me is that you can have two families who are relatively low incomes. In one, and often in my experience, people say from an African background, where the parents are very, very committed to education, they're really supporting the kids, they really want the kids to do well. So even if the parents haven't done so well and they're struggling a bit financially, these kids have a huge advantage that they're getting all this support from their parents, whereas you get another household where there may not be two parents and there may be no commitment to education at all. And I'm just wondering how, in a sense, these are the kids I feel we need to be targeting, and I just wonder how we can bring that into the system.
I think that's where your education professionals are important. Your school teachers, those that are involved in widening access work, they know pupils. They understand family life. They understand community life. They understand the need to support kids that perhaps don't have that support in the family home. And that's why this work is so important. There are children with talent, and perhaps no fault of their parents' background. Their parents perhaps don't value education because they themselves haven't had the benefits in life through education, but the children could benefit from that education. And that's why fair access work is so important. It's because there is talent that's not being realised. And I commend the work that's been done, supported by Parliament, to invest in this area, because it allows that talent to flourish. So I don't think necessarily it's an issue that we have to think about in terms of our design, because it's already happening there, that our teachers know which children have talent and need a little bit of push and support in order to realise that. And we increasingly have the interventions that are coming in the senior phase in school to allow them, if you like, to get over the edge, to have that little bit of push, that little bit of extra support, to provide that understanding of what's required that perhaps isn't there in the wider family.
I mean,
sorry, John, and can I just stress, I am not in any way, shape or form demeaning or decrying families who don't provide that support. It simply might be that that's not part of the family background, but it very much could be part of the child's future.
No, fair enough. I mean, if I'm understanding that correctly, I mean, in a better off area, there may be a fewer number of kids who are from a deprived background, but then the school can kind of focus on these kids and give them extra support. Whereas, some of the areas in my constituency, really the whole area or part of an area, they're all struggling, and that makes it very, very difficult for the school. So, I mean, is that a picture you kind of recognise? Because again, that pulls me back to the idea of the area, the kind of physical SIMD areas, is a good measure, because that's going to reflect into the schools. Am I being unfair?
Yeah. No, that's a fair point. I mean, if you're going to be efficient, you're going to target your work in the areas where you're likely to get the greatest return. So you're right, in the East End of Glasgow, you're right, there's more opportunity to make more of a difference than there might be in more affluent parts of Scotland, or in parts of Scotland where the schools are a higher proportion of kids that are benefiting from school. But still, in terms of measuring fair access, it's really important, I think, that we do it at an individual level rather than an area-based level. There's maybe two issues we're talking about there, John. We're talking about the work targeting in order to provide opportunity, and then there's the work measuring whether or not we are achieving fair access. I think we will continue to target schools and communities that have a low throughput to higher education and further education, hopefully in the future, to allow that talent to flourish, otherwise might not be the case. And, you know, there's some excellent examples of work going on. Think of the Young Strathclyde programme, which will cover some of the schools in your area, John, that specifically is targeting schools in Glasgow that do not have a tradition of large numbers progressing to higher education, to try to realise those talents, if you like, and provide them with that extra support they require to set them on a different path.
That's great. Thanks so much.
Good morning, Professor McKendrick. Just one of the things I wanted to say in back of what John has said about SIMD. My colleague John Mason and I have known each other a very long time. He's an accountant at heart. He wants that one data set that he can work on to kind of do it that way. But are we saying it? I kind of think it's maybe a basket of measures are needed. You've mentioned some of the ones here, you know, so it wouldn't just be one kind of data set on its own that would be the way forward, because SIMD might be good in some areas, but in other areas, everybody talks about rural areas, but in some urban areas it'll be one street that will be covered by it, but the street next to it will not be covered as well. So is it not just a basket of measures, or am I just overcomplicating things here?
I don't think you're overcomplicating it, but I think having a single headline measure is important. It gives focus to the agenda, and I think if you get the right single measure of focus, then it becomes credible. And I think we can achieve that. We can find the right individual measure to do that. There is, however, and I'm not contradicting myself, George, there is also something that's merit having a basket of indicators that sits alongside that, because there is a broader range of fair access work that's undertaken. And I think it's really important we're able to tell that story at the same time. Now, there is a broader range of data that describes the profile of the student population anyway. It sits there, you know, as part of that broader picture. But we don't talk about that as much because we only are focused on that headline measure. It's like so many things that we measure in public life. We focus on the headline, but there's a broader story to tell beneath that. And I think we have to get both right.
It's raised by John Mason and George Adam. You mentioned adult returners. I mean, is there a metric that you can use to capture them? Because they will not be captured, as you said, with free school meals and probably the Scottish Child Payment. I mean, is it possible to capture them?
So again, if you had a single universal identifier and you were tracking through time, then you would have, that's free school meal data would be there historically for us to be able to do that. That would be the very best way to go about that. So I think if we talk medium term and longer term, then I think it doesn't become as big an issue because you have the right data in place from the outset. Just now it might require a mixed economy. So it might require that free school meals data to be those for school leavers, but perhaps even continue with SIMD for those who are adult returners. I think, you know, until we get such times as we have that comprehensive data system that's tracking our young people as they move into the world of work and adulthood through time and their education journeys through time, then I think we need to consider that as an option.
Thank you. Willie Rennie.
Thanks, Convener, and thanks, Professor McKendrick. My question is really returning to your introductory remarks about school education. I mean, the figures yesterday were truly depressing. The numbers have flatlined, I think, since 2016. And University of Scotland were very clear that they may remain broadly static since that period when the campaign was launched by Nicola Sturgeon. My question to you is, have you got a message to government about how that failure to narrow the gap is having an impact on your work?
So I think University of Scotland are a very clear position on this, and they see that as being the main barrier in order that fair access can be achieved. And again, I'm sorry, Willie, I'm going to appear like a dog with a bone here. I come back to this idea of having a comprehensive data system, because it's not a case that everybody that's a fair access student comes from school into higher education. Many enter the world of work, then go into a college and then return back. Many enter college and decide they want to continue with their studies. So some of that work that's going on, while it certainly is not positive and nobody could suggest that it's positive, the results were released yesterday, it nevertheless undoubtedly will be the case is that many of those young people will move into further education, will begin to realise their talent in further education, will decide that actually higher education is an option for me and it's one that I would like to pursue, and then will articulate into university at a later stage. So I'm not as negative as Universities Scotland with these data. I do not think that this is a barrier to ultimately fair access being achieved. I think it's certainly difficult in terms of a direct entry from schools. It's, you know, if you don't have the talent being realised in school, then universities understandably can't accept as many from school into university, but it's not the end of the story. And I think that's something that we miss and we're not able to talk through because we don't have that data that allows us to track the journeys beyond school into higher education.
Completely with you on all of that. I think the variety of different routes, the kind of almost unique way that we have it in Scotland, is a beneficial way of doing it. And I accept that. But you must be frustrated about the failure to narrow the gap in schools. I mean, from your work in the higher education sector, do you have any advice for ministers about the measures that they should be implementing, the lessons that we can maybe spread across to the school sector to make sure that we try to narrow that gap? Have you got any advice about how that should be done?
So I think it would be wrong for me as somebody working in higher education to speak down to schools and tell them what has to be done in schools in order to achieve it. But I think you're right, Willie, you know, that more has to be done. We can't accept a widening gap. Never mind a gap that's not narrowing. We cannot accept a widening gap in higher education. I think the reality is that perhaps attitudes towards schooling, and you certainly have changed slightly since COVID. The COVID consequentials are still being felt, and I don't think that's an excuse. I think that's a reality. You know, some of that data that was produced yesterday tells us that there are more than 1 in 10 young people that are missing 1 day of school every week. There is 1/3 of our school pupils that are missing 1 day of school every 2 weeks. Now, that tells us something about what has to change in schools. Schools, for whatever reason, are not able to deliver to the young people. That might be because of health reasons, but it might also be disengagement from school. And I think it's these broader issues, perhaps not so much the education issues, it's the learning that's a problem, but it's that broader social challenges and social context that we really have to look at if we're serious about narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap. It shouldn't be taken as a failure of school teachers or a failure of school pupils because they don't have the ability. I think there is something broader in terms of the lives of school pupils or indeed of families and their attitudes towards school, and that's what we have to look at if we want to make further progress in narrowing the poverty-related gap.
Okay. Thank you.
George Adam.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning again, Professor McKendrick, and may I apologise for anything I may have said when you've refereed at St Mum Park in the past. It was entirely not personal and of the moment. But just to go on about access to, obviously, in my area in Paisley, we've got UWS who are quite good, very similar to your own Glasgow Caledonian, who do well in this area and recruit these young people to university. But for these universities, normally the access to do that is through colleges. You know, unlike a lot of other universities where it's through the straight from school, it can be people returning or people maybe slightly later in their life going through college. Now, is there more that can be done between the sector to actually ensure that colleges, working with colleges and schools, to see if they can actually help you with the work you're trying to do?
So I think there are some, UWS has got some stellar examples of work it's doing with colleges. It's actually now got the equivalent of a franchise arrangement with New College Lanarkshire, where you can do your University of West of Scotland degree for, I think, 4 subjects. You can do that in the colleges in Lanarkshire. So without leaving the college, you can get that university education. It's bringing higher education closer to where people are, making it more convenient for them to do so. So I think there is some innovation that's been undertaken, and UWS is not the only example. There are partnerships elsewhere in Scotland that do that. I think one thing that we have to do is we have to make sure that we have a system in place that means that people are at the right place at the right time. Colleges, have expressed some concerns that university has been so focused in meeting their targets that they're keener to get pupils in earlier than perhaps that they would, and that for some who leave school, the right place for them after school is college. Either full stop, a college education is a value in and of its own right, and very often is the right thing for many young people to do, or perhaps the right pathway to higher education is to enter it through college. So I think valuing each one of the sectors and the role that it plays is really important, not seen as competitors, but doing the right thing at the right time for our young people. And when we have these strong partnerships, and there are many examples of these strong partnerships, as I say, then that makes it more likely that we'll do the right thing for the young person rather than the right thing for the institution.
Thank you for that. The other thing that we talk about when we talk about people going to university from poorer backgrounds and is the fact that there tends to be a drop-off rate, which effectively year 2, again, it's something that UWS used to mention to me on a regular basis. And they used to say maybe this should be taken into account when the SFC are funding the fact that they've got to retain these students. But is there more that can be done to make sure that we don't have that drop? I know things have improved slightly, but there's still, you know, if someone's coming from a family with a chaotic background, they're still going to have that chaos in their life in year 2. So, you know, how do we make sure that we keep them the full term?
I think this has got to be one of the priority areas going forward is retention. There is, I've mentioned already this morning, there is absolutely no use throwing all our energy to getting people in if we're not prepared to allow them and to support them to thrive when they're in. So there is more work that has to be done when young people or adults have returned to university. And again, there is some good examples of work to do this. I'm not here to sing the praises of UWS, George, but you've forced me to do it once again. I mean, UWS in the last few years have employed what they call student success officers. It's working in a different way. It's basically early intervention. We know the signs of students early on in their studies that are maybe signs of students are not bedded in well, are not succeeding as well as they might. And they employ people not to go in there with a stick, you know, but they're in there and try and find support. You know, what the issues are, can the issues be solved? A person-centred approach to make sure then that they're able to settle into their studies. Now, this is just promising practice. It's not evidence practice. So, you know, we can't say that this is the solution that will solve retention. But it's a very good example of universities thinking in a different way, thinking that our job is not just to get people in and to teach, but our job is to get them in and think, right, okay, given the challenges you face, is the education we're delivering, is it going to enable you to realise your potential? And if not, to think about what has to be done. So again, it's just one example of it, but it's a sense then that universities can work slightly differently in order to retain that resource going forward, make sure the students are not wasting either of the public purse by getting in and not realising the potential that they have. Should there be a higher premium paid to wide and access students? I don't know if that's what you were hinting at as well, George. And it's interesting that in Australia, in the Australian Accord, that is something that was proposed as part of the Australia's proposal for working towards fair access over the course of this century, is that there an acknowledgement actually that it is more expensive to teach a student from a fair access background, and that there would be a higher levy paid by the state to the institution for teaching students from a fair access background. That's something that's not been proposed in Scotland. It's not something that I've yet established a position on, but I think it's something that's worth having a public debate on. That if we acknowledge then that there are higher costs to educating those with more challenging backgrounds, then is it reasonable to expect that the universities should bear that cost without some acknowledgement being undertaken in how we finance our students?
I think I was probably Professor McCormick coming from an aspect of Glasgow Caley and UWS possibly getting more better funding package than anything else, because they seem to be the ones that have continually been hitting the figures. But my argument has always been, and I know you can't answer this question, but just for the record, my argument's always been that sometimes some of the ancients, you know, they could... St Andrews survived the Reformation. You know, they can carry on without the kind of government funding, but not necessarily the exact same. I'm not saying this is a government position or anything. It's just a thought that I've had with the idea that, you know, some of the other universities are 70% of their funding comes from the government. So it might be a way of more flexibility in working that way. I think could be a way forward for us, or have the debate at least.
I think the debate's always worth having. I think universities would argue that they're not in a strong financial position at the current times. We know that the challenges that are faced in Dundee, but there are other institutions that are considering reducing the staff numbers just now, for example. So I don't think they're in a necessarily strong position, but I think the point you make is a valid point. The mix of funding that's required, the mix of funding that universities have is very different from institution to institution. And, you know, understanding what's required to make universities function, to allow them to thrive, I think is a conversation worth to be had. The point about UWS and Glasgow Caledonian bearing the brunt of this, I think because we use 20% most deprived as our metric, then the bulk of Scotland's 20% most deprived areas are in West Central Scotland, and that's why, in particular, Caledonian and West of Scotland are doing a lot of the heavy lifting in this field. Glasgow and Strathclyde also take significant numbers, but I would also stress that each one of Scotland's 19 HEIs is making a contribution to this agenda, and very often a proportionate contribution based on their catchment area. So we will never, if we just use SIMD, we will never ever have your Robert Gordons and your Aberdeen able to achieve the numbers, proportions of fair access that you'll get in Glasgow. It just simply can't happen because of their core population not being largely from deprived areas. And I think it's important that we value all institutions for the commitment they're making to this agenda.
Thank you.
Good morning, Professor McKendrick. I don't think we met before, but I offer no apologies for anything I may have said at Easter Road, if you ever had the privilege of going there. But I'm very interested. Your last comment kind of cut the legs from behind the question I was going to ask, which was basically to say that I know you've said that you don't support crude measures, but if you look at what Glasgow Caledonian University have achieved, it may be simplistic to suggest that that model could be applied to other universities, get challenge given to them to help achieve the aim, and maybe being a quite simplistic politician, the idea of having a target and achieve it, and achieving it is quite an important one in its own right, just for public confidence and so on. But I'm assuming there must be some compelling reason why that's not the case. But your last comment seemed to suggest that some institutions would never be able to achieve that target. I don't want to put words in your mouth, you can get a chance to come back, because of the core population that they have. Is that right? And if that's the case, how realistic is achieving the target in the first place?
Yeah, and it's a really important point, Keith, that you make there. It's a national target. And the national target then means that different parts of the nation are able to and will make a contribution to achieving that overall national target. Now, one thing that I have recommended, which I think there is support for, is that we don't have this single target. I mean, just now we have a target of every institution should work towards 10% of their students being from the 20% most deprived areas. And from the get-go, from the very outset, the institutions in the North East and to some extent Scotland's Rural College was never able to meet the target. And the institutions in Central Scotland will always meet the target, just simply by virtue of where they are. My recommendation that I've made is a more stretching target. I've suggested that rather than have this single figure for every institution, regardless of what their catchment area is, every institution should be asked to do at least as well as they've done beforehand, or better, in terms of increasing the number of students from the most deprived areas. And that would mean that your Caledonians and West of Scotland that have a very high proportion would be looking to do even better. And it would also mean those that seemed as if they were failing would be acknowledged not to have failed if they continued to make progress in that area. And the cumulative effect of that, Keith, would be that the national target could be met. You know, the national target can be met by those in West Central Scotland achieving more than 20%, and those outside of, or certainly in the more northern parts of Scotland and rural parts of Scotland, perhaps not reaching 20%, but reaching what's reasonable for them to achieve based on where they are within the country. Your point about, sorry Keith, I think you made 2 points. The point about Caledonian, and you know, I think it's a fair point. The principal at Caledonian would argue that there should be more places given to his institution because they have evident success in being attractive to students from the 20% most deprived areas. And if we wanted to make further progress to achieve the target, then giving more places to Caledonian or institutions such as Caledonian would be one way to do that. You know, it's an argument. I think it's one that's a debate to be had. It's for the Scottish Funding Council to decide where they put places within the nation. But I think I would want to value all institutions for the contribution that they continue to make to this agenda.
I suppose I really have to ask the question now whether the target is a worthwhile target to have. Aside from the fact in trying to achieve it, you can achieve a lot of good, obviously. Is that the target that we should have, given what you said, or should we be... well, it would be interesting to know as well, from your own experience, not just from the year that you've been doing this job, but from your own other experience, for somebody that's new to the committee, to understand what the historical context is here. Where are we in terms of what we're currently doing in terms of changing the attainment gap? You know, when I went to university, there was very, very few people from my background at university. Just to get an idea of the historic context as well, but also, is this the right target to have?
So I think for the reason that you gave at the start there, it's the right target because it does a lot of good. I think we are trying to work towards something that's well worth achieving. And at the end of the day, it's about young people and adult returners achieving their potential. And that's worthwhile working towards. It's interesting in Australia, when they, again, I go back to Australia, they're almost following Scotland's lead in terms of trying to follow a similar agenda. But they haven't estimated proportionate participation in their target over a longer time frame. You know, I can't remember the exact figures, but they aren't going for like 20% of the 20 most deprived. They don't see that as realistic to do that. They're still wanting to increase the proportion, but they're not asking it to be stretching a target as we've set ourselves here in Scotland. And I think one of the challenges about setting ourselves a really ambitious target is that if you don't meet that, then does that constitute failure? And I think it would be a great risk if we draw that conclusion, that if we don't meet that target by 2030, that somehow we have failed. Because actually, if we sit back and look at it, and you're right, Keith, the numbers of participating students who are entering university from the 20% most deprived areas, it's almost doubled in the last 10 years. It's an incredible transformation. Our universities are much more diverse than they were beforehand. And that's about people realising their potential. This is a success story for Scotland. Now, yes, there is more we can do. We absolutely can't be complacent. I think there are things that we have to do if we want to continue to make progress. But I would be very disappointed if we lose heart, because it seems as if the target we've set ourselves is a little bit beyond us. I think we continue to work towards it because it's the right thing to do for the country.
And last thing, Kavina, thanks, is just on that point. I know you mentioned Australia, but in terms of comparisons, international comparisons, even within the UK, and this is probably well known to other members of the committee, but not to me, how does Scotland seem to perform European-wide within the UK in terms of widening access?
So we don't have the measures, Keith, that allow a like-for-like comparison. I think what you certainly do get is you've got other parts of the UK that welcome and look with a little bit of jealousy, if you like, to the strategy we have in Scotland to pursue this. The commitment to fair access is stronger here in Scotland than it is in other parts of the UK. That's not to say that there are other things going on in the UK that would be welcome in Scotland. There's access and participation plans that have a stronger evaluation component to it south of the border in England. But I certainly think we've got a stronger commitment to fair access here than we have elsewhere. But in terms of data, it's very difficult to do a like-for-like comparison.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on the first point Keith Brown was raising with you in your answer, why then have we set that target for individual institutions if everyone knows that the North East, maybe the south of Scotland, more rural areas cannot achieve it? Why was it set in the first place, and why is the point that you're making now, was that not established at the very beginning and the more accurate measure, i.e. incremental increases year on year, established at the beginning?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Before my time, Douglas would be my answer to that, but I think the most important thing is we do the right thing now. We realise actually the right thing is to ask all institutions to do better, and we are fair in our assessment of the institutions in the North East of Scotland. I don't think we have been fair. There's a power of good work done in Aberdeen and Robert Gordon's to try to promote fair access, but every year when the data were released, there's the media story comes out about how they're failing because they are not meeting this target, and it is so unfair. Again, that's not to say that no better work couldn't be done, but I think now we're at a stage, and it is a mature part of the agenda. Perhaps it was attractive at the start just to get a bit of focus, get everybody wanting to make progress in a certain way. The same reason that SIND was an appropriate indicator at the very start, because it gave us something to work towards. But I think we're now maturing this agenda. I think the right time is to do better. And I think there is an acknowledgement in the sector, a sense of the support for what I'm proposing. And it is a challenge that I'm setting. There's no hiding place. I'm asking everybody to do better than they possibly have done in the past.
Okay, thank you. Miles Briggs.
Convener, good morning, Professor McKendrick. Thanks for joining us today. And I wanted to carry on the line of questioning both George Adam and Keith Brown have pursued, because I'm interested in terms of your experience, what you've had the chance to look at, and what these targets have delivered around unintended consequences and admission behaviours. And you've outlined really well in terms of we've, in some cases, set universities up to fail around these targets because they've not been able to achieve them. But in terms of students, are we creating this situation where we've got this target and we're now setting our young people up to fail, that they're not going to be sustained, but we can tick a box to say we've got them into university in year one, but sustaining them to actually graduate isn't happening? Now, I have seen here in Edinburgh some of the great work going on with care experienced young people, and that's a great model, but it's a very different model we're talking about for the wider student population. So just wondered what your view is on that. And specifically, this has driven probably admissions behaviours to change, but not necessarily deliver the outcomes we're hoping for.
It's in universities' interests for students to succeed. It's in their interest that any student who enters that university progresses through and graduates. There's a financial incentive for universities for their students to succeed because there's a continuation of fees in subsequent years. And I think that's led to changes in support structures in universities. That's one thing that's perhaps less of a headline, is that there's better support in universities to enable students to thrive. Is there enough? That's a question I think that's worth exploring. But I think it's certainly the case that we're more attuned to the needs of students and we are better able to attend to those needs to allow them to progress. Admissions behaviour, these are independent institutions. They have an imperative every year to have enough students progressing into their institution in order to be viable. I think you have to have a system for entry that doesn't allow hyper competition to become regressive. And I don't think we've got that in Scotland. I think while there are critics of the actual allocations and the cap numbers, I think that leads to a system that leads to a greater sense of collective in terms of what it is we're trying to do as a whole. And it dampens some of what could be the uber competitive behaviour in admissions that perhaps has been more characteristic south of the border in terms of imperatives. So I wouldn't say it's perfect, and it would be wrong for me to suggest it's perfect, but I think there is much more work goes on than is perhaps understood to support students to succeed in their university studies than is widely acknowledged.
Thanks for that. Is it fair to say, from your experience, that in some cases, though, we are seeing students who aren't ready for university, who can't be sustained in university, funnelled into going to university to meet this target? And, you know, politicians, all of us often will put in place these targets and think that's a good thing. But I think what we're hearing is maybe this isn't a realistic target for many parts of the country. But needless to say, we have created this system and institutions out there will try to meet it. So are we, and that goes back to my point in relation to care experienced young people, I think there is a really good model there to progress. But is it your opinion that that's happening?
So no is my quick answer to that, but that's not to be flippant and say that the issue you raise isn't an important one. My own eldest daughter went to university at Strathclyde and withdrew after a year, having successfully completed that because she was miserable and she wasn't enjoying it. There are many reasons why students don't succeed at university. So, you know, sometimes it's just a case of picking the wrong course and you have to step back out and you have to reorient. She did okay. You know, she went back to university at a later stage, the right place, the right course, and she did very well for herself. But I think there is an issue, and this comes back to my tertiary perspective in terms of fair access. I think there is an issue that we have sent the message that higher education is the outcome for our young people. And I think that in itself has perhaps created a system in place that overly focuses on higher education and doesn't truly appreciate the value of a college education for some young people, either as a throughput to higher education or as an end in itself. I think it's about creating better balance in the system, but I wouldn't want to overstate the point that we've created a system that's putting lots of young people into university who aren't capable or aren't ready. There will always be people, such as my elder daughter, who just wasn't right for them for a variety of reasons. But I think we have to create that balance in the system. And that will come, I think, when we've got a tertiary perspective to fair access.
Thanks for that. And just finally, and this is the million-dollar question, in your opinion, what's the likelihood of the 26 interim targets and the 2030 target actually being delivered? Or to put that a different way, what do you think needs to change to be able to try to deliver on these targets? And you've outlined concerns around geographic spread, but any other things you'd like to put on the record?
So I think in terms of 2030, I think it's realistic, although I would much rather it was an individual target. And I think, that would be a recalibration of the fair access agenda and actually would be more stretching than an area-based target as well. So 2030, I think, is possible. Next one, interim. If you'd asked me this question a few months ago, I would say actually the indications are not good because we had flatlined for a few years in terms of the proportion of fair access. However, there are some more recent indications in terms of early access returns that perhaps we are beginning to do an uptick again and that there is further progress being made. So I think it is now a possibility that we could meet that next target. I wouldn't think it's a certainty, but I think it's a possibility that we could meet it. But again, I wouldn't be overly, and this will seem a very odd thing that I'm about to say now as Commissioner for Fair Access, I wouldn't see it as a problem if we didn't meet the next interim target, if we were making progress towards it and we were doing the right things in terms of allowing students to access and allowing them to thrive when they're in it. To me, what's more important is doing the right things and getting the system right. And as a result of doing the right things and getting the system right, your stats will change because they reflect that at the end of the day. So I think it's a possibility, and a much stronger possibility than it was a few months ago.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Convener.
Ross Greer.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, John. You mentioned earlier on, the context that students have to exist while they're at university. All those other factors have a really significant impact on their ability to get there in the first place and then complete their studies. I'm interested in the housing situation in particular, and any work that you've done around that, any evidence that you've gathered around it, particularly given that Miles just mentioned care experienced young people who often have difficulties accessing housing, accessing accommodation while they're at university. The Scottish Government's programme for government in the previous years of this session had a commitment to a guarantor scheme for estranged young people and students in particular. That wasn't present in the most recent programme for government, so I presume that the government no longer intends to progress that. What impact are you aware of on students' ability to complete their housing, particularly those who are estranged from their family, who are care experienced, etc., from their inability to access housing, the lack of a guarantor who can help them with that?
Well, Ross, you have raised an issue that I have to say I am ignorant to, and I will assure you now that I will look into this going forward. It's not something that has been brought to my attention. It's a significant issue. I think it's one that you see, what you're explaining to me is something that's worth me looking at, and I will do so. I think we have to acknowledge that many fair access students remain in the family home. So you're right, it's a smaller proportion we're talking about estranged students or care experienced students, which is beyond the family. And I think perhaps if I can be critical of myself, because my focus has been in the bulk of that fair access population, I've understood then that these tend to be home-based students, and housing has not been as much of a focus as perhaps it should have been in my work. But let me give you an assurance that I will look into this beyond the meeting, Ross. And perhaps if you wanted to contact me to follow up on that, I'd welcome that.
Yeah, that'd be great. That's much appreciated. Thanks very much. In that case, that's all from me, Convener. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much. Just a few final questions, Professor McKendrick. We were wondering your view on including other characteristics within a basket of measures to analyse how progress is being made, including things that are maybe not currently considered, such as disability status and such like. Is that something you would look at, widening the range of issues you look at to consider progress? So
we do collect a broader range of data just now, but we don't headline it. The part of the ROA data is a broader range of characteristics of who enters university. This is one of my recommendations, that we should have a broader basket of indicators. It's something that I understand University of Scotland has welcomed, and a conversation will take place to explore what that might be. And I think what we do just now, if you think about contextualised admissions, which is really interesting given a sense of what universities want, although we have the 20% indicator as what we measure for fair access, if we look at the range of factors that individual institutions take into account in determining what has to be done to provide a little bit of extra support, to facilitate access. It's a much broader range of 20% most deprived. It includes, in some cases, an ex-forces background, disability, remote and rural areas. There is a broader range of factors that's currently being considered, and this story has to be told. And it inevitably will be a slightly different story in different institutions. What's considered to be more of an issue in the Scottish Rural College might be very different to Edinburgh University or Glasgow, but I think being able to tell that broader story is important. So I am strongly supportive of a broader range of indicators to give a more rounded picture of our fair access work. But, and it's a big but, I combine that with we must still have a central measure that provides focus to the agenda.
Okay, thank you. I want to go back to something you said in March 2024, so just after you had been appointed as Commissioner, and you spoke about the cuts in the government's budget to colleges, and you said you feared college funding cuts could deny students the springboard they need to get to university. Since you made those comments, we've had another budget which was passed in this Parliament yesterday, and on colleges funding, Colleges Scotland said it was a disappointment that there was a real terms cut in their budget and it posed significant challenges. So almost a year on from your concerns about the cuts last year, taking away or limiting the springboard students need to get to university, what's your view now with further real terms cuts to the colleges sector?
Yeah, I can only reaffirm my point. Colleges are vitally important to the fair access work in Scotland. If we were only measuring fair access on direct journey from school to higher education, then we would be underselling what we do, and it would be far, far fewer numbers from our most disadvantaged backgrounds. A significant proportion of our fair access students are adult returners who come through the college route. It's absolutely vital to allowing people to achieve their potential. And I think colleges have to be funded to a level that allows that work to take place. Although, again, I would emphasise we shouldn't just value our colleges as a vehicle to get people into higher education. We need also to value our colleges for the work they do in and of their own right as a direct entry route to the labour market for young people or adult returners too.
Okay, and final question. I went back and read the article in the Times yesterday, which you kind of started off the session by commenting on. I notice you're not quoted in it at all. There are no direct quotes from you, as far as I can see from the online version. But it does say the Commissioner for Fair Access admitted widening access to deprived pupils on lower grades would mean more middle and upper class pupils locked out of university, including some with stellar grades at high school. So can I ask you, those aren't your words, but it is a journalist paraphrasing. What did you say? And what would you like to comment on the record here in the Parliament's committee about that issue?
Sure. So it's a misinterpretation of the evidence that I submitted in advance to the committee. And, mistakes happen. I don't think there was any bad intention on the part of the journalist. What I said was that if you increase the proportion from one group, then that means the proportion of another group is getting reduced. That's a simple point of arithmetic. If you're going to increase the proportion of those from the most disadvantaged backgrounds going to higher education, it means that inevitably the proportions of other groups have to reduce. But that doesn't mean that the numbers from the more advantaged backgrounds have to reduce as well, because if you increase the size of the pie, then there's a chance then that those numbers will increase as well as those from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. That can be quite difficult to get our heads around, but it's actually the reality of Scotland over the last the time of the Fair Access agenda, is that the numbers from the most deprived backgrounds have increased significantly, but also the numbers from the least deprived backgrounds have also increased. The proportion has been reduced, but the numbers from the least deprived backgrounds has increased at the same time. And I think this is a really important point, because there is a sense about what we're doing by promoting fair access is taking places away from our traditional, more privileged parts of the country, who've always, had university as part of their eyes, and now they're no longer able to do so because we're giving the places to poorer pupils. That is a fallacy. It's a dangerous fallacy that does us a great disservice. The evidence does not suggest that that is a reality. And that, I think, is a really important point to clarify. As far as the particular words that are chosen, I think that was just a bit of embellishment in the journalist. These are absolutely not my words, as well as not my sentiment.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that is an important clarification. At the end of this first session on our inquiry into widening access, Professor McKendrick, can I thank you for your submission prior to giving evidence, your answers to the questions from members today. I know you'll be following the work of the committee as we progress this inquiry, as we will be following your work and your upcoming report next month as well. So thank you very much. I hope you're feeling a bit better and today's session hasn't worsened your conditions any, but thank you for your time, and I'll suspend the meeting for 15 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Can I welcome our second panel of witnesses? We have James Dunphy, Director of Educational Excellence, Advance HE, Rebecca Scarlett, Senior Policy and Information Officer, Leeds Scotland, Lydia Romer, Principal and Chief Executive, UHI North, West and Hebrides, representing Colleges Scotland, and Claire McPherson, Director, Universities Scotland. So welcome to you all this morning. I wondered, since most of you were in the gallery for part, if not all, of Professor McKendrick's evidence, if you had any reflections on what the Commissioner was saying in his evidence, and particularly some of the points he is looking for, perhaps in the year ahead, some of the issues about individual identifiers, colleges perhaps being involved in his remit going forward, and any of the other information that you heard that was of interest. And maybe Mr Dunphy, just because you're nodding your head, we'll start with you.
Sounds good enough to me. Thank you very much, Convener and Committee, for having us with you. It's a pleasure to be able to contribute evidence. I think it was really useful to hear from the Commissioner about the progress that's been made in relation to the COA ambition, and also to get a sense from him about the work that needs to be done over this next period if we're to achieve our ambitions around fair access. I think the big takeaway message from me from John's evidence, and just looking at the evidence that the committee received in writing in advance of the session, is that the work is not yet done. So whilst there is great progress being made, and we can see across our public bodies, in our institutions and in our communities, progress being made on fair access, there is further work for us to do. And I suppose one of the points I would make is that access isn't just about enrolment to a college or university. It is about enabling individuals to fully take advantage of the opportunity of higher education. And that is as much, as John was pointing, as about retention and success, about positive outcomes for individuals and graduates. If we focus on that, as well as the access challenge, I think we're much more likely to be able to secure for those individuals the types of positive progress that they want to see in their lives. And we're also likely to be able to secure the types of outcomes we want to see in terms of health outcomes and our labour market too. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Ms Romer.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. Colleges play a critical role in enabling multiple routes for individuals to access education post-school. The Commissioner kind of quite rightly highlighted the role that colleges play in the fair access agenda. So colleges are very much community anchors. They are providing a key role for individuals to step out of poverty and step into qualifications and better value jobs and work, and have a general transformational impact on the lives of individuals and their communities and the outcomes that my colleague James Dunphy has just described. Colleges themselves already make a huge contribution to fair access, and I was delighted that the Commissioner has recognised that. Colleges work with schools, significantly are involved with the senior phase, enabling pathways in schools to enable post-school choices. So have a direct role to play in young people's choices to access post-school choices, whether that's for college or university. Colleges deliver significant higher education themselves through HNC, HND, but also through their partnership agreements with individual universities, including degree provision that is franchised to them. And colleges have a significant role to play for adult returners and are a key provider of Scottish wider access programmes that enable access to higher education directly for thousands of learners each year. The college sector has supported the fair access agenda by working with the university sector in partnership in response to the Blueprint for Fair Access and the original COA report, through the National Articulation Forum and subsequently the Joint Articulation Forum that looks specifically at the ways how colleges interact as in partnership with universities to provide the platform for learners in colleges to enter undergraduate education in universities. And I can say more about that later.
Thank you. Ms Scarlett.
Hello, thank you very much for having us this morning. I was pleased to hear the Commissioner make reference to disability in response to your question at the end. I think even in the written evidence that's been submitted, there is still, I think, an omission of the understanding of the importance of including disability in the widening access agenda. We tried to campaign for including disability as a contextual indicator 5 years ago, and that has not happened. And I think that it's really important to understand and not underestimate the level of disadvantage that disabled people face. Children with additional support needs at school, I think the committee are really aware of the issues that are happening at school at the moment with the provision for additional support to learn. I think it's really exciting and hopeful to see how supportive he is of the role that college has to make in the widening access agenda, because you cannot have access without including college and also the other pathways. Lead Scotland support disabled people to learn in the community, and there's no way that our learners would be able to progress to higher education if that's something that they wanted to do without those transitions and without those pathways. So that's something we're broadly supportive of. And I also want to kind of reflect and talk today about the other bit of access beyond the entrance, but the retention, the participation, the outcomes for disabled people, which are always comparatively not as positive in comparison to non-disabled people.
Thank you. And Ms McPherson.
Thank you. I was really pleased to hear the comments from the Fair Access Commissioner, and I think if we look at picking up on James's point about, this is a success story, but there's more to do. And when we look at progress today, I think it is a story of partnership. That's a partnership and a collective effort within the higher education sector. It's the crucial partnership between the sector and schools, the sector and colleges, with government, with the Scottish Funding Council and of course with the Fair Access Commissioner himself. So I think we've got that collective effort, and we've got a sense of a common mission and endeavour around this. This is actually an inquiry that we sought out as a sector. Our sector is passionate about helping to achieve the 2030 targets, and we think that this is the right point in time to reflect on that kind of success story and reflect on the achievements that have been made, but also take a bit of a critical eye and look at what more could be done to help us drive towards that 2030 target. And hopefully, unsurprisingly, the Fair Access Commissioner raised a number of issues that the sector themselves have raised with us as key to helping us shift towards that. I was really pleased in particular that he highlighted the different roles that different institutions play. This isn't just a numbers game, and that passion and that commitment to this agenda is universal across the sector, and I know it's universal across our partners as well. So very happy to take part in this discussion today.
Good, good. If I can maybe continue with you then, Ms McPherson. In response to Willie Rennie, the Commissioner was speaking about the COVID consequentials and how that will and has had an impact. I wonder, from both the university's side and a college's side, how have you seen the pandemic and also the financial challenges your sector is facing? How has that had an impact on access and fair access?
It inevitably has, and perhaps I should just start by in the same way that the Commissioner did earlier, just clarifying the slant put on our University of Scotland statement around school attainment, because one of the really important things that we would want to emphasise is that we recognise the incredible work that's happening across all of our schools in terms of helping support our pupils, and COVID and the long legacy of that is not something to be underestimated. The thing we wanted to emphasise, and we think is really crucial, is that the original Commission on Widening Access report was very, very clear that school attainment has a hugely important role to play in meeting the targets. The targets themselves were set in anticipation of that attainment gap closing. And if we're looking ahead to how we're going to meet those, we feel duty-bound to point out that the context in which those targets were set was on an expectation that as we approach 2030, we would see that attainment gap close. Now, none of us could have expected the impact on the cost of living crisis and austerity, and of course the COVID years and the knock-on effect that that's had. And that's why we think it's really important to take stock at this point in time. But we know from our school partners and our college partners and actually universities themselves that the needs of students have increased, and the needs and the support that they have, and that's where we get into issues like retention. So it continues to be an issue for us, and we anticipate it's going to be an issue for years to come, in fact, as pupils work their way through the school system and on to post-school destinations.
And Ms Romer, Mayor, any comments from the college's side, particularly about both the consequentials of the COVID pandemic, but also the financial challenges that the colleges have been facing and continue to face?
Yeah, so perhaps first of all to comment on the COVID impact on colleges. I mean, as I said, colleges have a vital role in providing HN learners and equipping them to articulate into undergraduate entry with universities. And as my colleague Claire has said, this is very much due to excellent partnership working, strategic partnership working between colleges and universities. And it's one of the success stories of fair access, and it's unique to Scotland. It doesn't exist like that in that formal way in other parts of the UK. However, the contribution that colleges make to the Coward statistics for universities rely on the volume of learners studying for HNC, HND in colleges. And post-COVID, there has been a definitive drop in those HN numbers. Now, some of that was due to the COVID impact on school pupils and school pupils staying on for longer in school rather than accessing college education. Partly it was also due to, particularly in 2020, how school pupils were assessed and then the results enabling them to go to university directly. Partly it was also because there were additional undergraduate entry numbers, FTEs, given to the university sector. So that certainly had a detrimental impact on HN numbers in the college sector. There were also the behavioural issues that the college sector kind of has picked up, kind of, and the mental health impact of learners coming post-COVID into the college sector, and it has in some cases impacted on retention numbers and attainment in the college sector, which in turn, through HN attainment and retention, has impacted on articulation numbers. So whilst articulation is a really important feature of the college-university partnership, there have been some distinct kind of COVID impacts, and the numbers are plateauing, and they could recover. I'd like to make a comment about recruitment behaviour, kind of in the context of fair access. And it certainly played out post-COVID as well, in that universities were very much kind of recruiting learners that traditionally would have come to college first before perhaps either progressing to university or progressing into work, whatever their chosen outcome. There are perhaps unintended consequences sometimes from applying just a very rigid SIMD 20 target, and certainly institutional targets in the way the Commissioner has talked about. And those institutional targets, I'm glad to say, will be removed, and I hope the behaviour and recruitment, competitive behaviour, would be alleviated. Finally, financial impact. Given the huge volume and percentage of articulating students that come through the college sector, this funding or detrimental funding to the college sector means also impact on those numbers going into higher education. So there's a direct correlation, and the impact of 17% kind of deficit in the college budgets certainly is making itself felt, both in terms of the offer that colleges are able to provide in terms of subjects, as well as the volume of learners, as colleges had to shrink what they can offer as a result of the financial crisis for colleges.
Thank you. Mr Dunphy.
Thank you very much. So I wanted just to take us back to the point which Claire made around the long-term impacts of COVID and connect them to the remarks that you heard earlier from the Commissioner around the value of access, not just being enrolment, but also student success. Each new intake into the system is an opportunity, but it also presents challenges. And the students who are entering the system each year bring with them the legacy impacts of the education environment that they've had. In this case, we're talking about COVID. So I think one of the things that I think is important for us to bear in mind is, as we think about the access targets, we also think about that continuing need to work on retention and student success. And that's been a key area of focus for us as an organisation which supports the HE workforce in Scotland, particularly the educator workforce, there is absolute commitment to support securing student outcomes in the system. But the system also needs to be able to respond to the live needs of students. That was obviously a key theme that you were picking up in your earlier session.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to Jackie Dunbar.
Good morning, thank you. I'm going to direct my question to Mr Dunphy, but if I'm directing it to the wrong person, as I normally always do, can you please direct me to the right one? Sure. Basically, I was just wanting to ask what the risks and benefits are of sticking with the SMID as the main measure of progress.
So I think maybe I might say a few words, if that's okay, and then pass to colleagues on the panel, because they will also have some relevant expertise that you might wish to hear. I think one of the things that was interesting in the Commissioner's evidence was that message around a headline target. And I think one of the things that's been helpful in Scotland has been that policy coherence and that clarity of ambition. And Claire talked in her remarks earlier about what that has done for the system. It's had a cohesive effect in pulling people together to reach towards that challenging target of equalising access. So there is a real benefit, I think, in having headline measures. There's also an importance in focusing on socioeconomic disadvantage, so we know, and you will be unashamed to hear us talk about the positive impacts and benefits of higher education. We know that higher education can play a key role in breaking the cycle of poverty and opening up opportunities and helping people to get on in life and secure professional careers and improve things for themselves and for their families. But I'm sure we'll also hear through the conversation today of the benefits of not being limited simply to one particular measure, but of looking in the round at the range of things that can reduce people's ability to access higher education. That can be things like rural access issues, caring responsibilities. I think that blend is important, and I think that's what we heard from the convener, from the Commissioner in his first session this morning.
Okay.
Anyone else? Or?
If I may.
Yeah, please.
My colleague spoke about rural kind of issues with SIMD, and I know in the first session the Commissioner touched on that. And as is the area that I work in, it's close to my heart. I would absolutely concur that SIMD methodology is important and should remain a feature of the Fair Access agenda, but it's, whilst it's necessary, it's not sufficient. And I think other indicators are required. So there's a lot of work going on looking at a basket of more individualised measures, including work on including rural learners and reflecting rural poverty in a better way. Particularly local governments in rural areas like Highland, for instance, have a lot of experience of policy making and rurality proofing it. So distance to key services, for instance, distance to educational establishments, subject choice in very small rural seniors high schools with small school rolls, the availability of extracurricular activities, engagement with employers kind of in those small rural settings, and post-school access to further and higher education from within rural and island communities is really, really important. Rural postcodes are huge and just do not reflect density that is reflected in SIMD 20 measures. That doesn't mean that SIMD 20 is not valid. It's just it just doesn't bite in rural and island contexts. So that needs to be reflected and I think better amended in the targets going forward.
I would just follow on with those points, saying I think SIMD 20 has taken us to where we are today, so that's something that we should value. It's been a galvanising measure and it's helped drive progress. What I think you're hearing from the panel and from the Fair Access Commissioner earlier is that as we take an increasingly person-centred approach to supporting students when they're in university, a metric and a basket of measures that help identify those person-centred characteristics and issues is really vital. So we know that there are many people living in poverty who don't live in an SIMD 20 postcode, and likewise there are people in an SIMD 20 postcode who perhaps don't have those same needs. So if that's the only measure that we're applying our minds towards, then we're missing out on cohorts of people who really do need support to stay stay and thrive within a university setting. And so we're very much aligned with the Fair Access Commissioner's views that that basket of measures is vital, and really keen to work with him and with the government to develop those, and obviously with colleges and other stakeholders to bring that to life. But it feels to us like a real imperative that we get into a space where we're doing something to capture the unique needs of learners so that we can help them succeed and have the outcomes that we all want.
Okay. Can I just add as well? Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to support what the rest of the panel are saying, and I think everybody knows that SIMD is not a perfect measure. I just wanted to add, you know, the importance of thinking about individual measures and contextual flags. But for disabled people, they experience poverty more than non-disabled people. They have less qualifications. They're twice as likely to be unemployed. So we're thinking about this from a preventative measure as well, that they may not live in an SIMD household, but a lot of families who have disabled children face poverty because of the issues that they have to go through in order to get the right support. So I think it's really important to not solely focus on SIMD.
Thank you. We'll move to John Mason.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, really to build on that, I mean, Ms McPherson, you mentioned a basket of measures, and I mean, is there a danger, I kind of asked the Commissioner this as well, is there a danger that, you know, if it all becomes too wide and too, in a sense, too individual, it's very hard to measure if we're making progress or not, because there's just so many factors, whereas SIMD, you know, it's pretty clear cut. It gives us a clear measure. We know how we're doing.
I think the nature of any system that involves people is that it's complex. People have complex needs, and what we're saying is, as we've grown in confidence in this space, we want to expand our ambitions and make sure that we are assuring ourselves that we're doing everything to meet those needs. So I think the way the Fair Access Commissioner positioned it was probably right. There isn't still a need for a galvanising measure, but sitting alongside that, which is commonplace in many other systems, a series of other ways in which we can track and understand progress, and also think about other interventions we need to develop to meet students' needs while they're in the system, whether that's at the college end of the spectrum or whether that's as they're graduating.
And on the galvanising measure idea, would you stick with SIMD in that, or should it be free school meals, or should it be something else?
We've been very interested in exploring free school meals, and I think the Fair Access Commissioner's point on this national learner identification number really sits at the heart of this. This is something the sector has wanted for many years. We'd be fully behind any investment in a system that helps deliver that, because we're using other things as a proxy at the moment. The other
Can you just explain what this identification number is? I'm kind of new to this, so maybe it's my fault.
It's simply something that, you know, in the same way
like a national insurance number?
A bit like a national insurance number, something that allows you to understand where a person has been in their educational journey, in the same way within the NHS a patient would have a patient number. So it's something that allows us to understand the learner history, and therefore perhaps without having to ask people to self-identify, or you can pick up on the needs in the background.
And who would have access to that? Because, I mean, does that mean if somebody applies to university, that university can find out all about that person's history?
I don't think that would be the case, but I think one of the things that the Fair Access Commissioner is keen to develop, and the sector is keen to develop, is a conversation with government about how you could design something that would work for the learner and for the institutions. When it comes to other things that we could do, for free school meals are an obvious thing. The other conversation we've had with government, however, is around mature learners and the fact that we don't have that national learner identifier. So can we use things like access to universal credit or other historical data that would allow us to understand where our mature learners may have particular needs? See, all of this is a bit of a workaround for perhaps a more easy to access national system that would help us track learners through and track the outcomes that they achieved at all stages of their learner journey.
I mean, Ms Romer, you mentioned like rural areas where it's such a big area that there's bits of poverty and bits of better off and things. I mean, is it not the case though that a family that's poorer in a better off area will tend to get more support and care, whereas a family or an individual where everybody's in deprived area, as parts of the East End of Glasgow, for example, it's just that much more difficult for them to access care because there's so much need.
In a rural context, probably you don't have many communities that are like the East End of Glasgow. You have pockets of that, where you have area-based kind of concentrated deprivation, but in rural areas it's quite often, you know, individual households kind of that have deprivation, and cost of living is such in rural areas that actually the baseline cost of living is significantly higher than in some urban areas. So how we define poverty is also an issue in remote and rural areas. But it hides in these very large postcodes. There's other more area-based kind of issues in rural areas, like lack of infrastructure, lack of services, that I think are probably in parallel to kind of area-based deprivation in more urban centres. So, I mean, my view is that SIMD must remain the core kind of indicator, even in rural context, but there needs to be additional data gathered in order to reflect and identify rural poverty and to create the right responses for learners who come from rural and island contexts.
Yes. And Mr Dunphy, I mean, we're talking about trying to make the whole system more individualised to, I suppose, target where the need is greatest. I mean, a point I made to the Commissioner too was, you know, sometimes you get two families or households which appear to be in similar financial situations, but one, there's great cohesion, there's real commitment to education from the adults, and in another, there's not. I mean, can we get to a stage where we really do target the support at that individual or student that needs it?
So I think the reflection that the Commissioner made I would absolutely agree with, which is that's back to then the talents of those people who work within the system in ensuring the appropriateness of the support arrangements that exist. So, for example, in each region in Scotland, including in the region in which Lydia works and leads a college, there are colleagues who are working with individuals in the local environment to try and provide the necessary support, bridging and engagement to both raise ambition and to enable access. And, you know, for example, just to go back to that point around galvanising, you know, the University of Aberdeen's approach to contextualised admissions just doesn't look at SIMD. There are very few institutions, I suspect, in Scotland that are only looking at SIMD when they're making admissions decisions. They'll be looking at a range of other factors like refugee status, whether an individual is care experienced, what else is happening in their background to help understand the pattern of achievement and the future potential of that individual to be successful. But I think that takes me back to the point really around investing in that workforce, that access workforce that is playing a really key role in enabling students to proceed through the system in a way that's contextually relevant to their needs.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Nancy.
Thank you, Convener. And good morning to the panel. Thank you for your answers so far. I want to pick up on some of the points we've been discussing around measures and particularly to yourself, Ms Romer, around colleges. So we know that from a few weeks ago when we had evidence from some of your colleagues that people are attending college a wee bit differently. They're looking for different sorts of courses, for example, part-time. What do you think we need to do to measures to take account of that? And also, what should we be doing to ensure people who study part-time get a kind of better access to be able to get the support that they need to continue to in their career progression?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the CAWA measures focus on full-time higher education only, and part-time currently doesn't get measured kind of in the same way. That doesn't mean that you know, there aren't part-time routes obviously into higher education, and that colleges do support those. I think it's fair to say, and I'm delighted that the Commissioner recognises that the college sector has a whole wide range of qualifications that are valuable in themselves, and that HNC HND in particular is not just a springboard into university, but is a very highly valued qualification by employers, and you know. The end point of an HNC HND should be seen as a success in its own right, being part of the higher education kind of statistics. But the part-time route is especially important for adult learners, and who quite often have to sustain, you know, complex family lives, have to work, and are unable to come into full-time education in the same way as younger students are often able to do. And particularly kind of the college system to support students, the financial system, and I think for part-time learners in general, both across colleges and universities, isn't equal or equitable at the moment to support access to higher education. So I think there's definitely work that needs to be done, and the government's own kind of student finance and wellbeing study that it published in December 2024 has a whole basket of recommendations how the funding infrastructure for students of different ages, stages, full-time, part-time, should be improved in order to enable access to education at all levels.
Thank you. I know I take the point about the HNC, HND being a really valuable endpoint, and I don't want to undermine that or dilute that with my next question. So just to say I agree with that as an endpoint, which is incredibly valuable, particularly for employers and others. On the point about articulation, yesterday's data on colleges saw a reduction in numbers of students. In fact, I think part-time and full-time, if I remember correctly from the data, quite a significant reduction. How do you think that could affect what colleges do in general, but also articulation and the widening access agenda?
Yeah, it's a concern that the numbers have dropped kind of in the college sector for HN numbers. I mean, there's a number of reasons for that. There's still kind of a post-COVID set of circumstances that I've mentioned earlier. There's the recruitment issue into universities, but there's also demand from the labour market for that there's a significant increase in school leavers going directly into work over the last couple of years as a result of that demand, including the consequences of Brexit, I'm afraid. So there's reasons for the issues. It's not necessarily reflective of a systemic failure of access to higher education. So it's important to understand the numbers correctly. But I think there are issues that could be improved in the way how learners are supported coming into college and then through college into university. Student support funding, I think, is one of those areas that I've just highlighted that are critical for learners, particularly kind of with cost of living, support for mental health issues and health in general. Is also another area that unfortunately colleges have had funding removed for mental health support, and that is kind of a critical issue for students in the college sector to remain in study and to succeed and then to articulate going on. But articulation is successful, and I can say a little bit more about that either now or later, because it provides a significant number, not just on SIMD 20 kind of learners from SIMD 20 backgrounds, but also care experienced learners and learners with disability. That, I think, those areas could be more foregrounded when telling the story of fair access. But at the moment, it's very much on SIMD 20 and full-time access to undergraduate education.
Thank you.
And you want to come in here?
It's just to follow up on that point on part-time versus full-time. One of the other basket of measures we think would be important for us to consider when we're thinking about outcomes for students from deprived backgrounds is the fact that the current measures do not take into account part-time learning within a university setting. And we know that for all sorts of obvious reasons in terms of balancing life commitments with learning, or in fact the need to survive and pay your bills and pay the mortgage or the rent, that people need to be adaptable in the way that they access higher education. At the moment, for example, we haven't spoken about this morning, but the Open University in Scotland, all of their students are classified as part-time, even those that are actually studying what we would see as an intense full-time provision. They don't feature in the statistics. They're obviously geographically dispersed across rural Scotland as well as within one of our urban areas, but recognising the full achievements of the sector would involve, I think, us looking to include acknowledgement of the role of part-time learning in this space, because I think it will be increasingly vital as we think about about Scotland's demographic changes and the fact that we want to see more adult learners and more people upskilling and reskilling within higher education part-time is something that's an access issue, but it's also actually fundamentally an economic and growth issue in terms of meeting economic needs and employers' needs.
Thank you.
Ms Duncan Glancy, the Open University, provided a very good briefing on that to the committee, so the points have been well made in their written submission. Ms Duncan Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. And just to also get it on the record that I thought the points that have been made in the Open University submission to committee are really, really important and echo a lot of what's just been said, so thank you. I'll return in a moment to the student support, student experience, etc., because I'd like to ask a question about that, Ms McPherson. But before I do, on the sort of measure, still in the measure space, a bit on the articulation space, the unique number that we've spoken about, an identifier, seems to be something that we've heard a lot of evidence on about being really important. We've also heard that the pilot that's going on just now in the North East about this, I think some of the evidence said wasn't necessarily scalable because of some of the problems that they've faced. Could you tell us a bit more about what you think are the issues and what we could do to resolve them?
So the pilot in the North East is around the free school meals data rather than this learner identifier. But there are issues, I think, not least because you are, in terms of scalability, while it is the case that many students stay local, if you think about any given institution's catchment in terms of local authorities, it will involve one institution having multiple one-to-one arrangements with perhaps anything up to 18, 20, perhaps 20 plus councils. So what we are saying is we think that there needs to be a national solution that makes this work for all institutions and all students, irrespective of the proximity between the learning establishment and their kind of home address. So that's one of the issues around the scalability, is that we just don't think that we can roll it out and just hope for the best. Our understanding from engagement with government is they think that due to the nature of the kind of data gathering conditions at the moment, there would need to be some legislative vehicle to make that national kind of data sharing happen. We'd be really keen to see that happen. And, you know, it's something that we're continuing to engage with the Scottish Government on, because I think one-to-one relationships between a local authority and a provider start to become bureaucratic and administratively burdensome. But it's great to see that actually the principle of exchanging data on free school meals could have some benefits. It's the scalability that I think we have significant issues with.
So it's about having to have 18 or 19 different data sharing arrangements. Okay, no, thank you. That's really helpful. I've spoken to some of the organisations involved in the pilot, RGU, for example, and NESCOL, who are doing some excellent work in that, and they'd mentioned the unique student number, which is why I mentioned it in that context, as a mechanism that could make that a bit easier. On student experience, obviously, student experience to most of us round this table and in this room, we recognise that we need to support students to be able to get the best out of whichever institution they're at, school, college, university, or indeed in employment. Since the widening access agenda has been taken off, that may be more prevalent. So can I ask Ms McPherson, could you set out some of the things that universities are doing to support their students, and maybe talk about that work also in the context of the funding arrangement that you have, which is not necessarily improved over the same period?
Yeah. I think the Fair Access Commissioner gave a few examples this morning around support for students in terms of looking at early identifiers and early flags that they may be struggling, the support that's provided around mental health, and thinking through how universities use their discretionary funding, which is funding that they can use to target very specifically in a grant distribution model the specific needs of a student, and that may be about their childcare needs, it may be about access to and from university, but something that is available to universities to distribute to kind of help to make that experience more positive. I think the big challenge facing the university at the moment, and it's similar to colleges, is the backdrop of the funding landscape facing the sector. All of these things cost money, and we heard from the Fair Access Commissioner in other countries there's a recognition that where there are increased needs, that there's increased investment in the support that's invested in those students. That isn't necessarily what happens in Scotland. And actually what we've seen over a number of years now is, certainly over the last decade plus, is a real terms decrease in funding that goes into each individual Scottish student, irrespective of their widening access status. And that makes the challenge of providing these wraparound services and support all the more difficult. And well, that's one of the things that we are really, really conscious of. And it's the very last thing that universities themselves would seek to cut. But at the same time, the backdrop is, reduced investment, increased costs and increased needs of our student population. And those things create huge challenges for each institution, irrespective of the proportion of their students that are widening access. Because beyond the widening access student population, we know that there are mental health needs and other needs perhaps associated with COVID that need to be met. And that's a big challenge for each institution as we look ahead to the 2030 targets, is how do we resource the support that's required to allow students not just to access higher education, but also to thrive while they're in the system and to graduate with good career prospects and opportunities.
So would you support then the Commissioner's request that we look at entry but also student experience and outcomes?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And then my final question, if it's okay, Convener.
Mr Dumpy, and just now as he indicated.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for taking me. So just to echo Claire's comment there around that imperative of focusing not just on access but on student success. The delivery of the outcome for the student is not simply to enrol in a college or university. It is to secure the broader set of outcomes that they believe participating in higher education will bring. And I thought one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the evidence that University of Scotland submitted in advance is just how much work Advanced HE members have done in terms of admissions, practice and policy, and around that kind of wraparound support that exists. That support is really fundamental to student success. So getting the basics right really matters in terms of securing retention. And the latest data shows us that we have more work to do on retention. So as Claire says, the challenge is great, the commitment is there, but it's really important we keep that focus not only on recruitment but on retention.
Thank you. Ms Roma?
Yeah.
Just to add from a college perspective within the articulation context, there is a great deal of work going on to ensure that the delivery of an HNC-HND, where it is in a strategic partnership with an articulation route with the university, is actually aligned with that progression towards entry with advanced standing into a degree programme. And that is quite challenging and requires really quite advanced partnership working. So it's about how the college delivers the HN and prepares individual learners not just for success in the HN, but for the progression beyond that, given that it's a different type of qualification and is differently assessed from the undergraduate degree that the student might be progressing into, particularly if they enter into an advanced year 2 or 3 of that degree. Just as important is the culture of learning, teaching and assessment that comes with that, and preparing students for that. And quite often that requires additional support of learners in a transition programme that is run by both the college and the university together as part of these partnerships. And finally, it's also subject alignment, ensuring that universities who've got autonomy within the design of their degrees actually kind of align that in the right way to enable learners with national qualifications at HN level to articulate in a successful way. So SQA's HN Next Generation programme was extremely important in that way, but that programme unfortunately seems to have kind of stalled at the moment with the SQA reform.
Thank you. Do I have time for my final question? Thank you, Convener. My last question was for yourself, Ms Scarlett, and it was around student support for disabled students. And in 2019, the government consulted on student support for disabled students. And part of the recommendation of that was for a forum to look at what needed to change and to drive forward the change needed. Are you aware whether of that forum having been set up? And if it has, how's it doing? And if it hasn't, do you think it should be?
Yeah, so I was part of the steering group of that work and kind of helped to instigate that work because the student support element for disabled students was kind of missed out of the wider review of student support that had happened previously. So initially the scope was to look at DSA, Disabled Students Allowance. We were really keen for the remit to be a bit wider. So we did include student support in FE as well. There were a lot of things that were out with the scope of the review that there was a number of recommendations. That review started in 2019. COVID hit, so there was a delay. The design of the survey and the questions really started to become a bit out of date when COVID came in and things changed so much. We were pressing for the outcomes on the report. We included a lot of disabled students. We put a huge amount of resource and energy and time into that review. The report was finally released, I think, in 2023. A ream of recommendations and almost none of them have happened. So I know that the Scottish Heads of University have submitted a request to the Scottish Government to have that taken forward. Nothing has happened. And next to nothing, even some of the smallest recommendations that were made, nothing has changed. And now the work is all out of date. So all of that energy, all of that resource, all of that time is just kind of nothing has happened. So it's extremely frustrating.
Thank you.
Willie Rennie.
So I've seen directly some of the work that's been done at St Andrews University about widening access, and they are determined that any student that comes through the door succeeds, that they pass the exams. And I think the wraparound support that they have, which is tough, you know, it's hard work, but it gets them through. And I think we should recognise that some of the ancients have done some tremendous work. And I think it's changed the profile of those institutions. I've seen a difference in them. The figures yesterday, however, on school education, as I've referred to already in the earlier session, were depressing. And Claire, you've talked about how the impact of that plateauing of the closing the poverty-related attainment gap is going to have an impact on your institution's ability to deliver the widening access. Do you want to set that out in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'll start this by saying what I said earlier, which is we don't. This is in no way criticising the efforts of everyone involved in the school system. But the context around the targets is that central to the assumptions built into those targets was a reduction of that attainment gap, and it's something that everyone wants, whether it's university sector or the college sector. I would also say that we're not passive in our observation that this is something that we need to address, and actually we've had a couple of round tables with the Minister Day and the Cabinet Secretary in recent months, really focused on thinking about what the sector can do more broadly to tackle widening access. And one of the themes that emerged from that is how can we support the issue of school attainment from an HE sector perspective. And there's really great examples within the system of tutoring programmes, for example, where university staff and students go out and support school pupils to help give them that wraparound support within a school setting to allow them the opportunity to succeed and to help shift that attainment gap. So we're flagging it in part to say what role can we play to help make a difference in this space, because we do need to have, colleges need that pipeline of young people going through the door. We need that as well. It's the right thing for those students. So we're not passively observing there's an issue with the attainment gap. We're actually saying, what can we do to help make a difference here? And we think there's things that are currently happening in the sector with a bit of investment could be scalable and could actually make a real tangible difference to school attainment.
And are you able to track any improvement as a result of those?
There are a couple of the programmes have been running for some time. Like one of the programmes that runs at Queen Margaret University, it's in its 5th year. So actually there is some anecdotal, at least, evidence that it's having a difference from a school perspective and from some of the attainment perspective in that setting. So it's about us opening a conversation. And I started the session saying, widening access is a partnership endeavour. I think school attainment is a partnership endeavour as well, and actually it's in all of our interests to make a difference here, and that's part of the conversation we want to have. Is we all need to push at this because it's critical.
Yes, Lydia, do you want to come next?
Yeah, I think just to echo what Claire has said, colleges have a critical role to play with the school sector, and about 17% of further education enrolments are actually with school-college partnerships. And there's a huge demand from schools on provision that colleges provide, particularly into the senior phase, in terms of widening subject choice, and in the case of small rural and island schools, that includes academic subjects quite often, National 5, higher and advanced higher level, as well as provision that the Open University provides and other level 7 university provision that, for instance, in the University of the Highlands and Islands is available to schools. But that is key to enable to address the attainment gap in schools. But perhaps the related point is that we live in a post-school ecosystem where colleges are positive destinations for school leavers, and I think that needs to be plugged into the discussion on fair access, because not all school leavers will access university immediately after school, and I think the Commissioner recognises that we need to do the right thing by individuals and ensure that they have a positive destination post-school, and that includes coming to college, provided college also provides a pathway to university if that individual chooses to do that. And the role that colleges have with schools is important. It could be looked at as double funding by the government, because local government is funded for the school pupil, and then colleges are funded to deliver additionality to a school pupil, and there's potential risk here. But there is a real justification, not least because of the attainment gap, for colleges to continue to perform that role that they currently do.
Okay. Yes, Mr Dunphy.
Thanks very much. So I was just going to draw out, I think you're absolutely right to point to the excellent practice in many of Scotland's higher education institutions to provide bridging support. That's a result, I think, of their commitment to get it right for students. It's a result, as Claire mentioned, the kind of galvanised commitment that exists across Scotland, and it's, of course, the result of things like the Commissioner's involvement too. I was going to mention, in addition to the work that St Andrews does, I think Glasgow's top-up programme absolutely is worth consideration. It has a long history of impact, and just recently I know you saw Neil Cowie, the principal of NESCOL. The work between NESCOL and RGU I think is definitely worth considering, and University West of Scotland and New College Lanarkshire just recently announced the establishment of the first undergraduate school between a college and university. These are really commendable examples of practice and of collaboration across the system to support fair access.
Okay. That's fine. Thanks.
Adam. Sorry, we just...
All right, sorry. Thank you, Convener. But James, you've just put me straight into where I wanted to go with UWS in particular. I'm not saying that Paisley is, well, I'm saying Paisley is the centre of the universe, but UWS in particular, I've done this programme working with the colleges as well. And is there not a place where, we should maybe not just be like, yes, we've looked at SIMD and everything else, but surely working with colleges, because sometimes from people from a certain background, that's their access into further education, because I know in places like Glasgow Cali and UWS, if there's any drop-off in college, there's a drop-off in them, and that has funding consequences for them as well. So surely we should be looking at this at the totality of the whole thing.
So I think it's for ministers ultimately, rather than Advance HE, to comment on how you want to define the...
Let's just have a wee debate about
the fair access target. What I will agree with you is that it's important for us to look in the round at the performance on access. And Scotland has had a long history of colleges playing a strong and productive role in its education and skills system. I think we would all agree on that front. And over a number of years, we've had close partnership arrangements developed between many colleges and many universities. There's definitely more work that can be done in that space, but as I mentioned, in the North East and Paisley and UWS, for example. I think what is important is that increasingly, as we look to the future, there is more regional and place-based partnership, and the Funding Council has been investing in some regional tertiary provision pathfinders, which I'm sure you'll hear about at your next evidence session, as an example of how the system can invest in analysis of regional need and then respond to that in a joined up and helpful way. I do think it's important for us to think about collective effort around things like school attainment, and colleges and universities absolutely have things to bring to the table, and in many cases are bringing those things to the table in consultation with local education authorities.
Okay, just on retention in particular, if I use some of the written information we get from some of the OU in particular, 21% of their students come from deprived areas. UWS, it's 29%. 44% of them, or nearly 45, are first-generation students as well. So when you look at these figures, you know, you kind of say there could be an argument made, which I was talking to the Commissioner about, for the SFC to looking in a more flexible way, because that does cost, that support in these programmes cost each of these institutions a bit of money. So, you know, there's certainly, the Commissioner was saying there's certain places in the country that might never ever get to, or mainly because of just the demographic makeup of certain parts of Scotland, there's areas that are going to be doing it to the extreme. So is there not an argument to be made that we could possibly look at funding these institutions more to encourage that to actually hit the targets, because that's where the need is? Anyway.
The things I would come in on the back of the retention issue and point out is that when we speak to institutions about their understanding of what sits behind some of the retention issues, it often sits not with necessarily the institutional finance, but with student finance. So financial barriers and the costs of being at university regularly come up as a reason that a student may or may not continue within their studies. So mental health is another issue. So I think there's a combination of funding factors here. There's definitely something about the bottom line funding that goes into each Scottish student, irrespective of their background. There's absolutely something about student support and how that can be more equitable in the way that it supports the learner through, you know, challenging transitions as well, because the other issue that comes through quite frequently.
Claire, but just on that point, just to say that the institution would still need to find a way to be able to support said student, regardless of what that issue was. So the argument I'm trying to make is that should that not be looked at as a way of by the SFC?
In part, I'm agreeing with you. I guess what I'm trying to point out is that those needs aren't always simply widening access students, and actually what we're hearing from lots of our institutions is that in general student needs are increasing, and that student support, of course we need to support our fair access students, but actually the broader student population. So there's a conversation to be had.
I'm kind of coming from the aspects like 45% first generation university students. So there's a family right away that most of these students that go to UWS or of the SMID students are going to not know what it's like going to university. So there's going to be no support, not no support, families going to support them of course, but there's going to be a kind of, it's not a world that they're going to know a lot about. So you're going to, it's not just that one kind of, it's a family, it's not just individual, it's actually making sure you're giving that family the support to make sure that child or that young person gets that opportunity.
From the sector's perspective, I think more generally we think there should be more financial support for widening access. So actually, if you look at a university like University of West of Scotland or Glasgow Caledonian, there, you know, we think that what hasn't happened over the course of our trajectory towards this 2030 target is an investment in the widening access activity across the sector. There's a fund that SFC roll out, so we may pick up on your point that actually is there more discrete funding that could go to institutions that have the greater need, and that's a conversation to be had with the Funding Council.
Move the funding away from certain places to others.
I'm not sure that many of our institutions would feel that they were flush with opportunity to redistribute funding at the moment.
An additional point, if you don't mind. So I think obviously we're focusing in here on SIMD 20 students, first and family students, but there are other groups of students who are not as well served as we would like to see in the system, and I think that underlines Claire's point about being careful around the application of funding. So Black minority ethnic students are still receiving lower degree outcomes than their white peers, and yet there has been a huge amount of work in the system, both with individual institutions trying to take steps, but also working together through work with Advanced HE around our Race Equality Charter. So I think it's right and proper that we ask around what is the support individual groups need, but it's really important we keep in mind that there are other groups within the system, disabled students, black minority ethnic students, who also require support. And that's, I think, where some of the institutional perspective is coming from when we say there is a need for support within the system.
Keith, oh, sorry, Ms. Rowe.
Sorry, could I just add that the pipelines into higher education, like colleges, also kind of need more funding, because the funding per student, per student FTE is significantly smaller than the comparable student FTE funding in the university sector. So, and colleges are already kind of financially in a crisis, kind of with the value, the real term value, having decreased by 17% of that funding.
Just on the back of that, convener, just as you say it, I'm quite interested in that, because that it's kind of making my argument, which is I'm trying to say, you know, should we not be looking at we're going to say that we must get people from poorer backgrounds into education, higher education, FE. FE's the introduction. So when we're looking at funding, we should maybe look at it from that perspective, you know, and kind of have that idea of where are the access points. How do you do it, and who are the ones that are actually delivering it at the end? You know, that's the kind of argument I'm making, and it's one that I maybe hope others would listen to as well.
They're listening in silence, George, so they're taking it all in. We'll move to Keith Brown.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the point that's been made that targets will be for ministers and politicians. I think Mr Dunphy made that point. But we're now moving into a pre-election period when politicians will start to think about throwing around targets and commitments. And they will, for very good reasons, try to make them as simple as possible. And that's kind of my issue. So we've had a lot of evidence today about probably the need to review or refine the target that's currently there. However, my issue with it is much to do with the fact that targets like that do not allow for the extraneous things which influence them. So governments really should stop proposing targets that can be easily affected by things out with their control, because it makes them meaningless. And I would cite in relation to this target, you don't hear much about it, but I would imagine it's unlikely the target would not have been affected by 14 years of austerity, you know, bearing down on both revenue and especially capital budgets latterly, by the Liz Truss budget, the consequent inflation, double-digit, wage suppression, the cost of living, all these things, rising inequality as well, much of which, not all of which, but much of which is out with the ability of the Scottish Government to control. So when they're setting a target, they should be specific about what it is that they control, would be the point that I would make. And I just wondered what the views of the panel were in relation to that, because to make it a meaningful target, it has to be as simple as possible. But there may be the case that you have to have caveats in that target for it to be sensible. It's maybe just a plea to have more sensible targets that the electorate are presented with at the time of election. It'd be interesting to hear from the academic background any suggestions in relation to that. Maybe start with Claire McPherson.
Thank you. I think what you've probably heard over the course of this morning is a recognition that, you know, blunt instruments and blunt measures aren't necessarily helpful in the long term. To be fair to the target setters, I think we'd all agree that it did have that galvanising effect, that it's a simple target, as you've said, and there's something to aim for, particularly the fact that there's been interim targets along the way so you can actually measure progress. My opening remarks kind of touched on the fact, just as you've pointed out, none of us could have predicted some of the wider context that we find ourselves in over the last 10-12 years around cost of living crisis and COVID in particular. And that clearly does have an impact on some of the activities that we would see underpinning progress in this space. Where I think we heard the Fair Access Commissioner this morning, and I think in a really helpful way, talking about, I guess, without putting words in his mouth, a drive towards an improvement mindset, so constantly striving to improve rather than simply meeting a binary target. We could go beyond 20% if that was the mindset. So I think the sector would be very much behind that sense of understand where you are now and build on that in an incremental way to improve within the context that you're in, and that feels like something that we could all get behind. It's not too dissimilar to the kind of ultimate target, but I think the lectorate and others understand the concept of improvement and striving to better each year the access that the university has for widening access students.
Particularly interested in anything that could be helpful in trying to prevent the undermining of a target by the inevitable extraneous events that can affect it. I mean, for democratic accountability as much as anything else. But Mr Dunphy, you want to come?
Yes, I think we're all agreed, and I think John was too, that the value in having targets is useful in giving that galvanising effect. But understandably, our higher and further education institutions exist in the live environment, so they are subject to many of the things that you've mentioned there in their operating environment, not least COVID, of course, and the consequential impacts that's had on learners within the system, but also on the cost crisis and the pressures that has brought into their operations. I think maybe what you're hearing is a desire that, as we understand progress, we aren't closed-minded to the progress that we've made, which sits out with the target, and that we aren't, as we consider the performance and progress, closed-minded to the very real challenges that higher education institutions like those who are in our membership face right now. It's a really difficult time to be a leader in a college or university for many of the reasons you've cited. The commitment is undoubted, but the progress that you make, of course, is relevant and linked to the environment in which you're operating.
Okay, my only other question is really, we heard from the Commissioner earlier on, I forget the exact phrase he used, but he said, taken over a slightly longer period, 10 years, it's been a remarkable transformation, or words to that effect, a doubling almost in the number of people coming into further and higher education from challenging backgrounds. And just on this panel, we've heard things like remarkable success story, unique to Scotland, although it's a very specific point. Claire McPherson mentioned this as a success story. Yourself, Mr Dunphy, said great progress has been made, although we're not done yet. Now, that is not the narrative the public's hearing. And or it's important to me as a politician, but just the people that are interested, and it won't be the entire population, in thinking about widening access and their opportunities for access to continually get this apocalyptic kind of picture of it, which is what they'll get. They'll get it today from the stuff that's come out. Is detrimental. Just the same as pretending there's nothing wrong will be detrimental. But is there a danger we can demotivate people from saying, well, actually, there's no way I'm going to get into university. Look at this, what's happening just now. There's no way. So it is that kind of apocalyptic kind of approach to it potentially damaging? And if so, what can be done?
Yeah, I think whilst it's a success story, widening access to higher education, it's I think it's at risk of potentially a narrative that is there's danger to access to education because at all levels, because students cannot afford it because for a variety of reasons, cost of living, kind of needing to work, lack of provision in some cases, kind of relevant to them. I think it's really important that fair access sits within a wider definition of what is successful, what are successful educational outcomes. And I think from a college perspective, perhaps the downside of what is a very worthwhile kind of enterprise in fair access has been focusing entirely just on success being driven by access to university education, whereas more than half learners leaving school will not access university education but have successful educational outcomes. So I think success and access needs to be determined in terms of equity of that access and what is right for the learner, but what is also right for a balanced economy in Scotland and for successful communities and society. And whilst higher education is extremely important and access to that needs to be absolutely equitable, it's not the only form of successful educational outcome. And I think that is the story that perhaps needs to sit alongside the strategy, the long-term strategy for fair access.
To be fair, I did say college and university when I spoke, and I myself went to college before going to university, so I acknowledge that. But my point really is about what somebody, a parent or a child, thinking about access. And I think they should be open-eyed about the challenges for student finance and some of the things that we've heard about. But should they also be open-eyed about, I mean, we heard some of the stuff is unique to Scotland, other parts of the UK are looking with envy at some of the stuff we're doing. Should there not be some cause for a bit more optimism in their chances of actually getting into college or university?
I would hope the sector has tried to strike that balance, and actually last year we launched a campaign, a 40 Faces campaign, which is very much in the territory of celebration, so celebrating the achievements through the voices of 40 widening access students, 40 students who had been through the system, showcasing their achievements, showcasing the achievements of the institutions that they've taken part in. And we ran that campaign over the kind of latter half of last year, including an event with the Cabinet Secretary where we brought together students and members of staff who are working on widening access in universities and with Colleges Scotland and colleges officials to celebrate the achievement, because you are right, there's a fantastic personal stories of life-changing transformative experiences through college to university route, through school to university route, as return learners, as adult learners. So we have tried to do a huge amount to showcase the celebratory elements of this, with a view to saying, you know, at this point in time, as we're looking ahead to the 2030 targets, how can we replicate that, and how can we galvanise again behind this together and achieve more? So I think we have tried to do that. We obviously can't control media coverage or anything else, but as a sector, I think we're trying to be very even-handed in the way we're approaching it, and not resting on our laurels, but saying we've achieved a huge amount and we want to achieve a huge amount more.
Finally, Mr Duffy.
I agree entirely. I think it's possible to be both positive about the progress that's been secured whilst being restless for further progress now. And I think it's about how we manage that balance. I think we're deeply fortunate in Scotland to have a workforce working at the front end, not actually in our universities, but out in the communities in which they serve, who are bringing that message of clarity around what higher education is and isn't, so that kind of honest perspective of helpful advice and guidance. And it's important we tell that story, as University of Scotland did through its 40 Faces campaign, around the positive benefits, not just for individuals, but for communities and ultimately for our society and our economy. We need people to have positive experiences of higher education if we're to secure our collective goals.
Thank you. Miles Briggs. Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. Thanks for joining us today. I wanted to return to a question I asked the Commissioner earlier with regards to unintended consequences around some of the changes around current widening access targets, and specifically in relation to admissions behaviours. And just wondered, from your experience of your institutions, how that's changed and what your learning has been around that in terms of success or failure of students to then carry on right through to complete their course. I'll maybe bring you in, Lydia, for a college perspective.
Yeah, I think I've partly answered your question kind of early on. There have been, you know, particularly during the COVID years, kind of some instances where the behaviour of recruitment behaviour of university has impacted on, you know, whole college cohorts collapsing, kind of and clearing, and that has, you know, those are you know, negative unintended consequences. There is also potentially kind of the you know, the recruitment of students who would probably be better placed in a college context first in order to gain confidence in their learning and by way of preparation to post-college outcomes in university. So I think, you know, there's the risk, I think, with targets and pursuing targets is that, and targets only, is that there's potentially kind of a loss of looking at the individual and what's best for them. And I think, though contextualised admissions and the partnership working between colleges and universities is really a good kind of mitigation against that risk, in order to ensure that learners are supported in making the right choices for them.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to add on that?
I would just agree with Lydia's final point there. I think the key here is that we're working as part of an overall system, and actually something that happens in one part of the system can have a knock-on effect on other parts, and the strength of those relationships. And the joint articulation group, for example, that we have with Colleges Scotland, that Lydia co-chairs, is really fundamental to saying, let's work in partnership on a regular basis and think about collaboration as we all work towards an outcome that doesn't have unintended consequences for any one part of the system.
Yeah. I'd mentioned earlier...
You indicated you might.
Just going to add in relation to contextualised admission. So I actually do think that's an example of positive practice in the system, and the work that University of Scotland did in that space to bring higher education institutions together to look at contextualised admissions, and how you could do that in a sensible and appropriate way is worth knowing about. And indeed, that work built on work which had been undertaken by a group called Supporting Professionalism and Admissions, which had been supported by UCAS. So there was a team effort there to make sure that that could be got right. I think what's been layered into that in Lydia's comment is really around how the system then works together. So not just higher education institutions, but also colleges.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier around retention rates and looking at the SFC's report on widening access. You know, we have seen a decrease amongst all students, but even faster in SIMD 20 and a more worrying care experience young people with the good work which has gone on to try to sustain them in there, not just learning, but their whole wraparound care at college university. And just wondered what work was being done to try to take that forward further. I know from students I've spoken to, they want to learn and earn. They don't think timetable sometimes works for them like that, and they need to earn money, so aren't going into college courses. So wondered what work was going on in the sector to really look at that holistic approach for someone so that they don't need to then look towards studying all week long, but you could bring course time together so that actually there's more flexibility for people.
Yep, so institutions have looked at a range of different aspects, including timetabling, in order to support stickiness on programmes and support success and retention. I think the retention figures point to, although we've talked a lot about bridging and information in advance of study, they point to the centrality of the learning and teaching experience and of the importance of ensuring that learning, teaching, student support, whether it's on course, which every student will receive, or whether it is wraparound support, which may be accessed by only some students, is appropriate. That's something which I know Advanced HE members are really committed to, and 17 of our members in Scotland run Advanced HE accredited programmes to equip their staff on appointment and beyond to be able to meet contemporary student needs. So both in terms of the mechanics of learning and teaching, so how do you schedule it, how far advanced do you provide timetables, for example, and then actually what happens in terms of the course, those are aspects that institutions are alive to and work hard on.
Yeah. Is there anything else anyone want to add on that?
In terms of a few examples of things universities are doing, our Learning and Teaching Committee is pretty live to this issue, and from conversations we've had with members, things like actual timetable reorganisation has been considered, looking at a longer period of induction for students so that they feel that they're more supported in that first period at university, developing peer support networks to again make people feel that they've got that support amongst their peers to continue, and also focusing more on skills development alongside some of the more academic learning. So it's something that they're looking at, kind of constantly under review. It is also worth highlighting what I mentioned earlier, that some of the other factors are non-academic factors that mean that people don't stay on in their studies, and that's largely around student support and financial barriers within their kind of personal lives, etc.
Yeah.
Probably in addition, just to say that between college and university, there are institutional differences, and actually the franchise kind of agreements of delivering degrees in college settings enables learners to continue with the support environment that they've enjoyed and have a continuity of their learning experience. I mean, there are other issues in bringing the university onto a college campus, but nevertheless, the efforts that have been made in partnership are very successful, and degree hubs like in New College Lanarkshire are really innovative. But there are many colleges that have degree provision on campus, and of course you have with UOU and with the University of the Highlands and Islands integrated tertiary kind of models where the learner can move seamlessly kind of through both further and higher education.
Yeah, and have you looked specifically at the retention rates around care experienced young people, given some of the bespoke packages which are made available? I went to visit Edinburgh University recently and looked around at the student accommodation for that year-round offer, which, if young people want, can be provided. And just wondered why we're seeing that, because all of us around this table are looking at the bill which is forthcoming from government, and we are now midpoint. So the fact that we're going backwards on this is really concerning, and just wondered what you have seen that as being problematic around and any learning we can take from that.
I think that goes back to, does the target tell you the whole story? So structural inequality doesn't end at enrolment. I think what you've seen in relation to care experience students from the campaigns launched by Who Cares Scotland through to the promise, through to the work of individual institutions has been a real sea change in terms of the offer to care experience students, in terms of the tracking from application through to enrolment, in terms of the range and types of support, whether that's academic support or, as we're pointing to here, things like 365-day accommodation. Those things are really positive in the landscape. They're delivering a real difference for care experience students, but there are, as I said earlier, much more work to be done, including with students, to understand their specific needs and what interventions will particularly help them.
Just to follow up on James's point, the other thing it's worth reflecting is the connection with the promise itself, and I had recent engagement with the Chief Executive of the promise, and we're really keen to make sure that, again, we're looking at ways at a sector level we can do more to support this agenda and understand some of the underlying issues.
Yep. Thanks for that. Thanks, Convener.
Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thanks everyone. Of replies and helpful. Can I just ask, there's a question that was asked actually previously of John McKendrick, about what you think the likelihood is of the 2026 interim targets and the 2030 aims being achieved or delivered. Anyone with an idea about that? It doesn't have to be positive, but it'd be nice if it was.
I would echo John McKendrick's answer in that I think anecdotally we're hearing that, you know, having plateaued, there's potentially some progress emerging from the sector based on recent data. I wouldn't underestimate, just picking up on Keith Brown's earlier comment, you know, the fact that there are factors outside of our control as we head towards 2030, and I wouldn't underestimate some of the challenges societally we may be facing. I think that it's not an unachievable target, but it will take a huge collective effort for us to get there, and that's part of the reason that we're really keen for this inquiry to look at this and for that kind of phase 2 of this work to really focus in on the things that will make a big difference for us. It's about student support and student funding. It's about investment within the sector, ensuring that the sector is funded to provide all the support that's required to make this a reality. It's also about data. It's about the basket of measures. It's about understanding in a granular sense really what is and isn't happening within the system, so we can target our efforts in the right way. And it's about making sure that everyone, it's not just a university sector endeavour, as we've spoken about colleges and schools, but the whole system gets behind this effort. And with a fair wind, we should be able to get there, but it will take the whole system to do that.
Thank you, Claire. And James Dunphy.
Thank you. So I'm not close enough to the figures to be able to give you the certainty that you're hoping for, but I think what I would say is even if the targets are not fully met, that does not mean and should not be interpreted as positive progress not being delivered. And I wanted to point to the number of black minority ethnic students from SIMD 20 areas, which has increased from 490 in 2013-14 to 925 in 21-22. That's a positive outcome for those individuals, and we can be really proud of the progress whilst knowing there is more to do.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else? Everyone? Please. Lydia.
I think the only thing I would add is that the Commissioner highlighted kind of a number of initiatives that are hopefully gathering pace and momentum. So within that is also the reform agenda, and focus on enhanced career information. So particularly the Withers report and the recommendations there focus on a much better learner journey through post-school education, and certainly through the Joint Articulation Group we're in direct contact with the Careers Collaborative, how we can improve on careers information that allows learners to map a better pathway through into higher education.
Okay, thank you. And Rebecca, I know that you might have some background knowledge on disabled and people with issues other than the poverty. Maybe that's part of it as well. But do you think that the targets are possible?
I mean, I can only speak from a perspective of disabled students, because that's purely my expertise in the area that I work in, and there are obviously not particular targets set in place for entrance for disabled people. I think one of my concerns is that because the proportion of disabled students first year entrance is now up at 21%, that perhaps people are going to think we can celebrate that, we can rest on our laurels. And I would just want to make the point that it's really important to look at the granular information and to disaggregate that information, because we've seen a huge rise in people presenting and disclosing with mental health issues, and actually that's really skewing the data. So that's leaving other people that perhaps are facing more persistent inequality with different impairment types behind. So in the written evidence had referenced the fact that, for example, people with a visual impairment, there's been no movement whatsoever in terms of the number of blind students entering university, and yet the numbers have doubled in terms of the increase in presentation. So that's just one example. So I think it's really important not to look at disability as a homogenous group, and I know that that is really difficult, and there's challenges around that. But for right or wrong, there's been an increase in on social media and in the public arena around mental health and using mental health vernacular, and we are seeing a huge increase in young people identifying with that language, and that is potentially skewing some of the figures for disabled people.
But, broadly speaking, people are still being positive in their approach to aim for those targets anyway. I think everybody is working together by the sounds of it, and that's excellent. Got to remember, things have to actually be widened out sometimes, actually, but that's good. Thank you.
Could I just check, Ms Scarlett, do you think targets for the number of disabled students would be helpful, or would it be counterproductive anyway?
I think that it's important to look at, again, the persistent inequality. So it would be helpful to look at the granular information, to disaggregate the data, and to look at where, as per the Equality Act, where is there persistent inequality? Where are the groups that are still experiencing those issues? And linking that with the work that's happening at school with additional support for learning provision, to see whether the particular pinch points where the focus needs to be. So yeah, I think it's important to set targets, but it's important to not just have that solely for disability as kind of one measure.
Yeah. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. On the point you made about the different impairment groups within the data, I noticed from the data that we shared in advance, the figures on people with visual impairment was something like 0.1% quite a while ago, and is still only 0.1% now. Do you know why that is?
Well, I think that part of that is to do with the issues around provision at school. There's been a reduction in specialist teachers for visually impaired pupils. So we're seeing less investment, we're seeing less specialist teachers, we're seeing that decrease. There is difficulty in getting the right support. There is delays in getting access to the right technology. I think all of that will contribute to that one particular group. But it's the same on a kind of wider basis when you're looking at students with autism, students with ADHD. We know that there's a huge backlog in reference to accessing CAMS, in reference to getting a diagnosis. All of that kind of has a compounding effect for your students with additional support needs.
Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. May have cut my question towards the end of the last session with the Commissioner around student access to housing, which is a significant barrier in the context of the widening access agenda. I know there are some individual universities who've done quite a lot of work on this, particularly for care experienced and estranged young people. But I'm just wondering, Claire, if you could maybe share with the committee if you're aware of any wider work in the sector to address the housing issues that students from backgrounds that would be considered under the widening access agenda have experienced, how that's been resolved.
Certainly. One of the issues that came through our 40 Faces campaign that I referenced earlier is that support system, and housing is obviously a key issue there, not least the cost of housing for students. And actually one of our 40 Faces was actually an estranged student and spoke quite passionately about the support he received at Glasgow. So there are obviously really good examples within the system. I'm more than happy to actually write to you with a bit more detail around what's happening within the sector more broadly, but we know the issue, that intersectionality, particularly for widening access students who tend to be home-based commuter students, and the care experience in a estranged student population obviously is often getting overlooked in that space, and that there are, I think, some really good practice examples within the sector that we're happy to write to you and provide you more information on.
That'd be great. Thank you very much. And Lydia, while you're here, any particular examples from UHI about how you address the housing issue, particularly given the rural context makes it significantly different. Glasgow is actually a great example of particularly widened access for strange young people, but the urban and rural context around housing and student accommodation are obviously very different.
Yeah, I mean, there's a well-known rural housing crisis in general, kind of in most parts of the Highlands and Islands, certainly. UHI has student residencies and operates very much a priority system for learners from particular backgrounds, widening access backgrounds, care experience backgrounds, and both for further and higher education accommodation, actually. We attract quite a lot of learners from the rest of Scotland and the rest of the UK, as well as international learners. But care experience learners have a guaranteed student accommodation place, so they get absolute priority. The issue is there isn't enough housing supply for the demand. And it's when the university or colleges are financially challenged, they are often unable to invest further in student accommodation. And that is a real issue. There is a real disadvantage. But housing such as it is prioritised for those with biggest need.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Keith Brown.
Thanks, Convener. It's a very brief question and probably a brief answer, I'd imagine. Is there any information, I know it will be a small number and difficult to track, any information on ex-forces personnel accessing either further or higher education? Didn't expect the answer to be that short, to be honest.
So if I may just say, I mean, my university, UHI, I'm not here to speak for UHI, but has a covenant kind of for veterans and ex-army personnel, and so does my college. So, and that is promoted through channels in direct relationship with the armies and the armed forces.
Nobody engages with the armed forces in terms of resettlement programmes or things like that? No.
So my understanding, I don't have data to hand, but my understanding, and maybe we could share something post the committee, is a number of institutions have signed up to the Armed Forces Covenant, and through that then have made a series of commitments around the offer that they make to people exiting the armed forces. But I don't know if that's something clear we might be able to provide.
I was going to make an offer that we could give you details of those institutions, because obviously Minister Day is also the Veterans Minister, and it's something that he's particularly interested in. So I know a number of institutions are involved in this, but I can give you the more granular detail in writing.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much. It's okay, I'm coming to you, Willie. Don't worry, I've not forgotten. I just want to close this part. In response to Keith Brown and Ross Greer, Ms McPherson, you offered some more information. This is quite a short inquiry we're doing on this, and in fact next week is our final evidence session, so I don't want to set too strict a time frame, but if we could get that as quickly as possible, then allows us to consider that as part of our report consideration. I do want to thank you all for your evidence today. I think it has been quite a wide-ranging and in-depth look at some of the factors that are affecting fair access, both with the Commissioner before you and with this panel. However, Ms McPherson, we would like to take advantage of your presence here today to ask some issues that are currently topical, both with the announcement in Parliament yesterday on funding to Dundee University and some of the press comment that we've seen about Edinburgh University. So if it's okay, we'll continue this session a bit longer to widen out onto the university issues, and I'll take Willie Rennie.
I should have known you wouldn't have forgotten, Convener. From a University of Scotland perspective, I mean, the situation at Dundee is pretty grim. Many of my constituents work at the institution and they're extremely worried about the future. I'd just like your assessment of the funding that was made available yesterday in terms of a loan through the Finance Secretary, and what further investment you think is required, and whether that can prevent any job losses, or do you think job losses are inevitable?
So I think the statement by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance yesterday, I think, was gave Dundee as an example of an institution that would receive investment. I think my understanding is that technically the decision on where that money goes sits with the Scottish Funding Council. We haven't had the opportunity to engage with the Funding Council in detail on that. I think there's an assumption that Dundee is an obvious recipient for that additional funding and that loan facility. At this point in time, the leadership within Dundee University are obviously working on an overall recovery plan, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to, not least because I don't know the details of that recovery plan, to comment on the extent of job losses or otherwise. But it's clearly a really challenging situation. There are obviously some unique circumstances in Dundee that have come into play to get them to this position. And I know from the Minister's actually earlier appearance at this committee that there's a commitment to a review, and I think that would be something that I wouldn't want to kind of speculate on what that review may reveal, but it's clearly important for everyone that recovery and sustainability is achieved for Dundee as a city region, and for all the economic benefits that the university brings there, and also for the broader sector, because it's obviously really, really important for us that there's a healthy and thriving sector in Scotland. But I wouldn't like to comment on job losses or any of that detail.
Thank you. Briggs.
No, this is putting you on the spot in terms of different institutions, but you know, I've received a number of communications from constituents who work at Edinburgh University following Professor Peter Matheson's message to staff, basically saying that radical action will be needed to find £140 million of savings at Edinburgh University. Now, the unions have described that as presenting devastating cuts, and obviously a lot of people working in these institutions are worried for their jobs and their futures. Now, I know you can't comment on individual universities, but is this a sector-wide issue now? And what sort of health check? We have looked at Dundee University already, but what's your understanding of where university finance is sitting across Scotland? Because it seems to be a drip-drip effect we're now seeing from institutions. And I think that's deeply worrying for staff, but also the future sustainability of, you know, what is such an important sector to our economy.
So I think it's fair to say that University of Scotland's been saying for a number of years now that the trajectory of public funding in the sector is unsustainable. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies towards the end of last year described, ahead of the budget in fact, described the situation facing the sector as a perfect storm. And I think that's something that across the sector we would recognise, and indeed across the UK sector there's financial challenges, albeit that they have a different funding model. We've seen a real terms cut in investment in learning and teaching of 19% since 2013-2014. We've also seen, as we've discussed this morning, rising needs of students, so the needs within, so the costs associated with supporting students going up. We've seen inflation and inflationary cost pressures affecting the kind of operating costs of institutions, and crucially we've seen the instability of the international student market, which is traditionally cross-subsidised not just our student population but also our research base. So it is absolutely clear to us that these issues are manifesting themselves in different ways in different institutions, but there's no institution that is immune, and I think the announcement at Edinburgh yesterday is just an example of that. We are keen to have a dialogue that takes us into a space, hopefully with cross-party support, about a future funding model for the sector that is sustainable. Our plea for sustainability in this current budget, we didn't get everything we asked for in the budget, and there are rising costs, like, for example, the national insurance contributions that the university will have to meet, and they'll have to find those costs within this depleting financial envelope. So it is of course a cause for concern for us as a sector. It's not something that should be a huge surprise to anyone, in that this is consistent with our messaging over a number of years, that we're looking forward to a situation where we can have a revised funding model and approach to investment that helps stabilise the sector and sustain it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Karina.
Mason.
Thanks. Thanks, Convener. I mean, you said no institution's immune, and although earlier on we did talk about how there's quite a big difference amongst universities, and I mean, one of the differences is that Edinburgh's got reserves of some £2 billion, and I think Glasgow's got about £1 billion, whereas Caledonia, West of Scotland, these universities have very, very little in comparison. So Edinburgh could run for 15 years with a deficit of 140 million and still be stable. So I'm struggling to understand why they're making anyone redundant, and you obviously can't speak for that university. But is it not the case that we have some very rich universities who don't need support and some poorer universities who need more support?
I don't think that is the case, and I think sometimes, with high running costs, reserve positions can look quite healthy when in actual fact they aren't as healthy, because they're not all readily available cash that could be used to support an institution. I think the opportunity for us to have a broader conversation about the mix of income that comes into each individual institution. One of the sector's huge strengths in Scotland is its diversity, so I absolutely appreciate you're recognising that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to the blend of funding that comes into an institution. But the reality is that costs are rising and income is precarious or falling, and that's something that impacts different institutions in different ways, but it doesn't mean that it's not a concern for each institution, and that's part of the need for us to have a broader conversation around funding.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Two quick questions, please, if it's okay, Claire. The first is, you mentioned the £15 million announced yesterday. It was your expectation that, or it was your understanding that you think it will be for Dundee University. Is it your expectation that it will be for Dundee University and that the Scottish Funding Council should use it for that purpose?
Having not had the opportunity or advance notice of the announcement, our understanding based on the Cabinet Secretary's announcement to Parliament is that there's certainly a large proportion of that would go to Dundee, but we haven't had any clarity around that, and I wouldn't want to prejudge the SFC Board's decisions, and therefore it's an assumption rather than a clarity that I would give to that.
Okay, thank you. And then just a final question, having saw the brilliant work that's going on across the sector and universities, I'm really proud of the diversity of the universities that we have in Scotland, and I hope to see them flourish for decades to come. Can you give us any reassurance that principals and others at universities are watching carefully what's happening in Dundee and are prepared to look at any suggestions about how they could work going forward to ensure that they take any of the recommendations seriously across the sector, so that we get a really strong sector again moving forward?
Absolutely, and I think one of the features of the sector in Scotland, and we touched on it earlier, is the collaborative nature of the work across all 19 institutions. It's a genuinely cohesive and connected set of leaders and institutions across the piece, and therefore, of course, if there are lessons that can be learned for the broader sector, for SFC, for the government or others, we'd hope that everyone would learn them, and we'd take the opportunity, in due course when the review is published, to do so.
Do you have expected prior notification of that funding? I mean,
no,
not necessarily, but I mean, it's not as if something changed in the last week. I mean, were there opportunities for ministers to have more engagement about it?
I can't speak for the engagement that the Minister may have had with Dundee or indeed may have had with SFC. But
as you point out, this at the moment doesn't automatically go to Dundee.
I don't have the detail of it. I really can't tell you. I think the wording of the statement alluded to the fact that Dundee was an obvious beneficiary, but created some space, because I think it talked about funding for the sector for universities such as Dundee. I think that was the wording, and therefore it opens up a little bit of a space for it not necessarily to all be Dundee. But I would assume that Dundee would be one of the bigger beneficiaries of that funding. And until we know from the SFC, I say we can't really comment or speculate.
Well, we have them in next week, so we may also have an add-on at next week's session and ask them some questions on that. Once again, can I thank you all for your time today? Really helpful evidence, and I will suspend the meeting just for a couple of minutes to allow our witnesses to leave, and the committee will move into private. Thank you.
I'm going to start the meeting at 8 o'clock.